Joe Rogan Podcast. Check it out.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night, all day.
Hello, Joe Rogan.
Good to see you, my friend.
You too. Always good to be here.
You have an air of seriousness about you, like you prepared yourself for this conversation. We've been fucking around all night last night, having a good time.
Now I have to transition.
Now you there was an immediate shift. I can see you're like,
all right.
Here it is.
Well,
There's a lot of shit going on.
Well, we got a brand new war to end, so
Yeah.
it's gotta be. So when I first started coming on your podcast, what was I just measured it in how many wars ago that was? I think, what was that? How many wars ago was
We were
that?
still in Afghanistan back then, so we did get out of one.
We did get out of one.
Sorta.
We did it in flawless fashion. But yeah, no, that is true. We did end one, and then I think we took like a 2-week break before we got into Ukraine, and then and now there's this one is pretty serious, and there's a big possibility of like a wider war being started. So pretty bad, not great.
No, not great. It scares the shit out of me. I've brought it up many times, but when I really get anxiety is like late at night when I'm alone. I think about the world like that at any moment. It could just go haywire. Like think about October 7th, right? It happens out of nowhere. In one day, everything changes, right? That can happen anywhere. That can happen right here. And people thinking that it can't, and then people that are just not even inquisitive about anything that interferes with their narrative. Not even thinking, okay, what is the big picture here? What is actually going on? I know this side says one thing and the other side says another thing. So someone's got to be wrong. So what is happening? Either Israel is evil or Hamas is totally evil. You can't be, there's a lot going on, right?
For sure.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
But this binary thinking that everybody has in our culture today, where people, we automatically subscribe to whatever one side thinks. Like if you're on the right, you automatically subscribe to whatever the right-wing people think. And if you're on the left, you automatically subscribe to whatever the left-wing people. Which wars are we supporting? And they're different sides are supporting different wars, which is very strange, right?
Yeah, it's bizarre. Like it's binary thinking that people just fall into, but war is the worst of it. War makes people so stupid. I mean, it's like the way they talk about these things. Like you said, it's like the side of pure good versus the side of pure bad. It's like a 7-year-old boy playing with action figures. Like this is good guy, this is bad guy. And reality is almost never anything like that. It's always enormously more complex than that. And I think that's the truth with the history of Israel and Palestine is that it's not. And I'm Jewish, so like I grew up very much just only hearing the Israeli side of the story. And it's basically, you can still get this in a Ben Shapiro video, that millions of people watch. But it really will. Their story is just kind of like, the Jews came here and we just said, hey, we want to be independent. And then in response to that, all the Arab nations attacked us. And then we just keep offering you peace. And they just keep saying no. And they just want, we just want to live in peace. And they just want to kill Jews. And that's the story. And there's nothing else that you need to know that's relevant here. But that's just so not true. There's so much more to it than that. And if you're gonna tell this story and you want to zoom out and really understand what's going on here, it's just if you're going to ignore the fact that the creation of Israel involved kicking a whole lot of people out of where they were living at the time and had been living for hundreds of years. 750,000 Palestinian Arabs were kicked out of their land. Many of them were forced out. Many of them fled and then were never allowed to come back. And
this was in 47?
Well, it started in 1947. Let me just say, by the way, and I'll just do this quickly, but I just like a disclaimer, which I never did when we were talking about all the Ukraine stuff with. Because, like the last few times I've been on the podcast, we talked about the war in Ukraine a lot, and I totally opposed America and American involvement, and I put a lot of blame on America and NATO for kind of provoking the war and continuing the war. And all types of people who disagree with me, they say, Like, you're a Putin supporter, or you're spewing Russian propaganda.
Right.
But I never felt the need to kind of be like, no, by the way, I'm not a Putin, agent or something, because it's just so stupid. There's like no Americans are sworn loyal to Vladimir Putin. There's zero people like that. But there are actually people who hate Jews. And so, just to be clear, that's not my perspective at all.
I actually know
I love Jewish people. I love Israelis. I think there's lots of cool things about their society. And what I'm saying, if I say like, hey, the way you got your land was really fucked up and you kill a lot of innocent people, that's nothing I wouldn't say about my own government as well.
Right.
And I love America. So just as the first disclaimer there.
I know a guy who actually did move to Russia. And
all right, fine. So there's one, but
Jeff Monson, he was an MMA fighter.
Oh yeah, he fought Tim Sylvia, right?
Mm-hmm. He fought a bunch of people. He
Yeah.
fought Chuck Liddell. He fought Fedor, and he moved to Russia.
Really?
Speaks Russian. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I overstated my case a little
He
bit.
loves
There's Jeff
Russia.
Munson. Nobody else.
He's got a
though.
hammer and sickle tattoo.
Okay. All right. So there might be an exception.
He's a wild
to the
fella.
rule. No, but so you said so. Yeah. So in 1947. And this is like right in the aftermath of World War II, and the British Empire was basically crumbling, and they had been ruling the territory of Palestine under a mandate, and so they basically washed their hands of the situation. There had been issues for years already, and they kicked it over to the United Nations, and the United Nations was a brand new organization, or like a year old or something like that, and they had no authority to like create states out of nowhere. It was a recommendation. They go, we recommend this partition plan that would have given 56% of the land to the Jews for a Jewish state and 44% of the land to the Arabs to have an Arab state. And at the time, the Jews, the Zionist settlers there, they owned about 10% of the land. And so this recommendation was that they get 56% of the land. And so immediately the Zionist settlers accepted. They went, yes, great deal. We'll take 56% of this. And the Arabs were like, no, that's not a fair deal at all. And then pretty immediately after that, there's a great book by Sheldon Richman called Coming to Palestine, if you're interested in the topic and you want to see. But immediately after that, a bunch of essentially like Zionist militias started kicking Arabs off of the land. Like, hey, the UN said this part's ours. And like at first a civil war broke out. And in this process, hundreds of thousands. I mean, between 1947 and 1948, the total number is around 750,000 Arabs who were forced out or fled. And then in 1948, Israel declared independence. And then as a response to that, outside Arab nations invaded, got involved in the fight. Israel won, and then after Israel won the war, they seized about 80% of the land. So they were offered 54% or recommended 54%. They won a war, and then they just took 80% of it. And then in 1967, so this is in 1948, then, but at that point, at the end of the war, the portion that is the Palestinian territories today, that was the West Bank and East Jerusalem, that was controlled by Jordan, and Gaza was controlled by Egypt. And then in 1967, Israel launched a preemptive war, and they won again. And then they just took 100% of it. And then they just took control of the West Bank, all of Jerusalem, and Gaza. And they've had it ever since. Jeez. They won a war in 1967, and they've occupied these territories ever since. And the Palestinians in these areas they just have no rights. They have no natural rights. They're just nothing. Like they are the government of Israel. For most of the time, they were literally occupying it with the IDF, not worse than martial law, because it's like a foreign military, like foreign occupation. And they've always maintained control of everything that goes in and out, what supplies, how much food, how much water, how much electricity, all of these things. And look, it's just, if you're going to talk about this situation, as so many people do, like so many people in like Ben Shapiro's camp, they talk about this conflict, talk about October 7th, and just leave all of that out. And if you do that, you're just not really having a conversation about what's going on here. You know what I mean? Like you can never really like grapple with the situation if you don't at least acknowledge that this is what's going on, and then they just get sucked into like the dumb George W. Bush, they hate us for our freedom and all that, and you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. It's the same mentality of that. You're either against Hamas or you're for Hamas or something like that, which is pretty stupid.
Isn't it fascinating that on two occasions, 9/11 and in October 7, there's an initial response from the world, like anger, outrage, horrific scenes. And then, because of the attack and the response to the attack, then most young people now, like when I was in New York City 2 weeks ago for the UFC, and there was the Free Palestine March. And it's wild, dude. I mean, the fucking streets were filled with people. It looked very organized. And they attacked the UFC bus. And they slashed the tires of the bus while Robbie Lawler and Jamal Hill were on that bus.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. Apparently, there was a thing where they were blocking traffic. And the bus tried to get through before they got there. And they got angry at the bus. And so they attacked the bus and smashed windows and slashed tires.
Jeez. Yeah.
They're so lucky that Jamal Hill and Robbie Lawler didn't get off that bus and just start putting people into orbit.
Dude, I don't know how many protesters it would take to beat up those two guys. But
you have zero chance. Jamal?
It's a lot.
Dude, Jamal can crack. That's a big fella, too.
Yeah.
He's a big fella and he can crack. People are running from him. He's going to crack one or two people and everyone's going to run.
Yeah. Yes, probably.
100%.
Yes, my money is on the professional
someone's going to
too.
recognize Robbie Lawler.
Yeah.
Someone's going to recognize him.
Yeah.
And they're going to realize, oh my God, these are UFC fighters. And there's two of them. Oh my God. And then you're going to realize, like, who else is on the bus? Let's get the fuck out of here.
Yeah. No, well, look, it's probably for the best for those protesters that it didn't go down that way. But yeah, it's been pretty, look, the protests, and it's global. I mean, they've been all over the world and in huge numbers.
Now, let me ask you this. How do they get organized?
I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. And it does seem they're in large enough numbers that it seems hard to believe they're 100% organic. Like there's something there. I'm sure people do feel passionately about this subject, but it is, it's pretty, I don't know. I haven't seen any good reporting on like tracing like the money or like where it's coming from, but I'd be interested to see that. But I do think that there is like look, October 7th was a huge, horrifically awful terrorist attack. But it was a big one. Like Hamas has never pulled anything like this off before. This has never been pulled off, I don't think, in the history of Israel, something on this scale. And the response to it is also something that is like Israel's never done before. And so the thing is just so kind of horrible and right in everybody's face that I do think, at least to some degree, there's an organic, reaction to it.
And Elon had a very good point. He said, how many, with these people die, how many more future members of Hamas are they creating?
Yeah.
Because of these attacks.
There's a great clip of Pat Buchanan, and it was like around 15 years ago or something like that. It was like debating on MSNBC with some other guy, like a pro-Israeli guy, and he made that point where he was like, because something had just happened, like Israel just did a raid or a bombing campaign, and some innocent Palestinians died, and he was just saying, he was like, who are the like a little girl died or something like that, and he was like, who are the brothers and the nephews and the cousins of that girl gonna grow up to be? And if you look at the timing of it, they're probably right around the age of the Hamas fighters there. And that's not, of course, to justify terrorism at all, because it's never justified to go target innocent civilians. But you do have to understand where we're kind of trapped in this cycle where when some of our people die, we want to go kill some of their people. And then we kill some of their people, so they want to come kill some of our people, and back and forth and back and forth.
Yeah.
And that's the awful thing about all of these wars on terrorism, is that they always just become, and you can see it. Look, this is what Hamas. This was the whole point of it too, right? It's like this is now the best propaganda and recruiting tool that Hamas has ever had, because now they terrorism is almost always about trying to provoke a reaction. Like, this is why Osama bin Laden did 9/11, is that he knew he couldn't, like, militarily defeat the United States of America, but he thought he could pull the same trick on us that we taught him to play on the Russians and get us to invade Afghanistan and bankrupt ourselves. And so what do you think Hamas... Look, Hamas pulled off a fairly sophisticated attack. I mean, they came by, like, land, sea, and air. They took out the Israeli surveillance, which is supposed to be the big, the greatest surveillance system in the world. And they pulled this off. Does anyone think that they didn't expect an Israeli response from this? It's like, no, of course they knew exactly what Israel would do. And this is what they were trying to provoke them to do. Because Hamas doesn't care about innocent Palestinians dying. But what they wanted was to turn, the world against Israel, and particularly turn the Muslim world. I mean, not that it takes much to turn them against it, but to really put pressure on some of these other governments who had, signed on to the Abraham Accords, which basically was using U.S. tax dollars to buy off these other Arab countries to sell out the Palestinians. So basically for years, these other Arab countries wouldn't recognize Israel, wouldn't normalize relations with Israel, because they were sitting there saying, like, hey, this is totally unfair. Like, you kicked all of these people out, and you don't really have a right to this land, and they need to be, treated with whatever, given independence or something like that. And so we won't normalize relations with you. And then basically Trump's plan and Israel's plan was like, well, how about we just bribe you to normalize relations with Israel, even though we're not giving the Palestinians their freedom. And he got a bunch of them to sign on to it. And so for the Palestinians, this was like, I mean, you could almost imagine the hopelessness, because now this was kind of your only hope, that someone else was going to catch your back. And now everybody's basically agreed, like, yeah, look, you're never getting your state. You're never getting your independence. We're never going back to 67 borders. This is life forever. And like
an open air prison.
Yeah. I mean, people get upset about that characterization, and it's not perfect.
It's not perfect, but it's
close.
It's containment.
Yeah.
It's some kind of containment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, it's imagine, if all you got to do with all of these things. This is why I would like Ron Paul is the greatest American hero in my opinion, because like this was his whole central point on foreign policy, was always like, you just have to try a little bit to put yourself in their shoes. And how would you feel if you were like occupied by a foreign government, which essentially isn't really a foreign government. It's really your government, because they're the ones who really run the place. And how would you feel about that? In the West Bank, where they're still under military occupation, these guys, the IDF run in and scream curfew. And you got to run inside your house when they do that. Just like that, even just that level of like
that's crazy.
Being controlled by a group of people who are not your people,
Isn't the most crazy thing that that human beings still behave in these patterns where we have groups of people that don't know at all, that have no personal interaction whatsoever with other groups of people, and they're willing to murder them?
Yeah.
Like this, it's sort of like a default mechanism of the default part of the human system. Like, human beings, when they have control of massive amounts of property and resources, they default into that mode. And that's just what's really insane about all this, is that I would have thought by now we'd have figured that out and moved past some of the most ridiculous ideas, but we haven't. It's still battles over religion, battles over territory. Like, holy shit, it could be the end of us over the dumbest battles.
And it's just, it seems like you would think that just with what we have, like the level of civilization that we have, the level of technology and medical innovation, like all these things, that you'd be like, you would almost think if you didn't already know what the truth was, you'd be like, well, war, we don't do war anymore. There's big mass murder campaigns with giant machines of death? We don't do that. That's like a thing we did 3,000 years ago. We've moved past that. We have other ways of like resolving these disputes. But
they still do it.
But we still do it.
Do you think that Israel believes they can dismantle Hamas and install a government that they can reasonably discuss things with? But even if there was a reasonable discussion, like what would that entail?
Well, okay, but this is what I'll say, right? I think that totally could happen. I mean, it's tricky, but the history of it is, this will kind of blow your mind. And by the way, this is going to sound like a conspiracy theory if you haven't heard this before, but this is totally 100% true, and it's been run in the day after. On October 8th, there was a big piece in the Times of Israel about this. There was a front page of Haaretz. These are big newspapers in Israel. And if you want to, you can go to antiwar.com. My boy Scott Horton and Connor Friedman just wrote this great piece about this, and they've got all the quotes in it, so you can just go read it for yourself. And this is in their own words, that this is admitted, that it was Benjamin Netanyahu's strategy for years to prop up Hamas. Specifically because then there would be no negotiating a state for the Palestinians, because no one in the international community is going to look at Hamas, this terrorist organization, and say, yeah, we recognize them. So the plan was to undermine the more secular Palestinian Authority types so that they wouldn't be in control, Hamas would be in control, and then no one would ever negotiate their state. So just to be clear here, this is, and by the way, I mean, you can find direct quotes from Benjamin Netanyahu saying this in his own words, saying that you must support Hamas, we must continue funding and supporting Hamas so that they can never get a state, specifically for that intended reason. So basically what Benjamin Netanyahu did was, for years, prop up this terrorist organization and then fail to defend his people from them on October 7th. And it's just, it's mind-boggling to me that this element gets left out of the conversation in America. But by the way, it's not left out of the conversation in Israel. Like, their newspapers are all talking about this, how this plan blew up in his face. But it's really, this is what happened here. It's not that there's this desire at the highest level of the Israeli government, because this is what they always say: we have no partner for peace. We have no one who's willing to negotiate with us. But it's just not true. Every time they have had somebody who steps up, and look, just to be clear here, when I was talking about 1947, 1948, how Israel, like the state of Israel, was created, then in 1967, when they took control of everything, what everybody always says, I shouldn't say what everybody always says. There's people who say crazy stuff. But what Arafat said once he rejected terrorism, even what Hamas said when they first, gained some power in Gaza, was 67 borders. They want to go back to the 67 borders. So they're not saying we want 100% of this back, at least at those points in time. They were just saying, give us our 22% back. You know what I mean? And let us be an autonomous, independent nation.
So what would have to happen for that?
Well,
first of all, that seems like there's no way Israel's going to accept something like that.
It seems
that,
as long as the Likud party's in, I don't think so. I mean, I think what you really need is, like, the Likud party and Hamas have got to go, and like a new generation, of leadership has to come into power somehow, and there has to be like a desire to actually end this thing.
Is there any support in Israel for this idea that they should give them more land and that they should give land back?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, there has been for years. There's always been kind of like the liberal wing of Israeli citizens who are totally against building the settlements in the Palestinian territory, who are oppose the occupation, who are for return to 67 borders. I mean, look, Yitzhak Rabin, if you remember, he was the prime minister in the 90s, and he was kind of he was at least saying, I don't think this was like completely true, but he was at least saying like that's what he wanted, that he wanted to make a deal to give the Palestinians a state. And this was at the beginning of the Oslo Accords, and if you remember when Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin came over and shook hands with Bill Clinton and stuff, and there was at least talk of like, we're going to do this, and he had support from his people. Now, a right-wing Israeli murdered him for that because they thought he was being too soft and negotiating. So there's a split for sure, but it's not as if there isn't any desire for this. Now, I'm sure if you do polling, on October 8th in Israel, I'm sure they were very pissed off, and you know what I mean, like that isn't the dominant belief. And if you do polling in Gaza right now, I'm sure they're very pissed off at Israel. You know what I mean? Because there's the rally around the flag effect when there's terrorism or when there's war. But there have been people on both sides of this who have had a desire for peace for a long time. And that's just like, by the way, if you're interested in this stuff, if you want to do like a deep dive on the whole history, Daryl Cooper, do you know what, did I ask you last night?
Yes, you did. We talked about it last night, but tell everybody who it is.
So he's Daryl Cooper. His Twitter handle is MartyrMade, and he co-hosts the podcast with Jaco. It's one of his podcasts that they do together. But he did on Daryl Cooper's solo podcast, he did this deep dive into the history of Israel and Palestine. It's a time commitment for sure. It's like 25 hours or something like that long. It's 6 parts, and they're all several hours long. It's great, but it is so good. Like I could not recommend it highly enough. It is so good. He knows the history so well. It's filled with all types of like these like little nuggets of information. I thought I knew this stuff pretty well, but I got all types of nuggets of information from him from over the years. And you can just tell right away, he's totally not that guy. He's not the guy on Twitter who like thinks there's a Jewish conspiracy. He has nothing but contempt for that kind of like stuff. He's not presenting it in a political way. He's just being a historian. The only thing that he kind of adds in of his own opinion is he kind of just insists throughout the whole thing that you put yourself in this group's shoes and now put yourself in this group's shoes. Right. And so you can understand why they feel this way and you can understand why they feel this way. But it's just a telling of the history of the story. So anyway, the series is called Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem. And then he did a follow-up podcast. So that's basically the history from early Zionism in the late 1800s up to, I think that gets you up to like the 1940s.
Before I forget, I'm going to order that up on my thing right now.
Yeah, dude, it's so good.
Fear and Loathing in the New
Jerusalem. Yeah, double check me that's
a trailer he made.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Want me to play that, Joe?
Sure.
Okay. Switch that. Play. Doesn't seem like it explains anything. I thought it might. It's just visuals.
Oh, yeah. I guess you're not really going to get...
Yeah, I thought it was going to be explaining something. It's just visuals and...
Okay, music. I just subscribed to the MartyrMade podcast.
Yeah, you're going to love it, dude. It's so good. And he's on point with all of it. It's just like a really detailed, accurate like history of it. And then, of course, like as I always say, I mean, if you want to understand any of this stuff, my guy Scott Horton at antiwar.com is like, I think the best voice in America when it comes to war, and he's just brilliant, and he does a lot to make me look good because he's like this ultimate genius researcher, and he has like all the details from he's like every little quote of like that hanging them by their own words. Like he's done all the research of like, look here, you read his books and you're like, here it is in their own words, and so that's he's an incredible resource for understanding this stuff.
Before I forget this,
sure.
I wanted to bring this up earlier. Mm-hmm. You were telling me last night, you were explaining to me when Netanyahu was being protested.
Yeah. So this was going on literally right up to October 7th. And I'm not suggesting any conspiracy or anything like that, but basically Netanyahu was trying to make some pretty unprecedented moves with like drastically changing the Supreme Court's level of power within the Israeli government. I'm not the expert in this. I don't know exactly what the moves he was, but it was really stripping. There were like these proposals to strip the Supreme Court of their power and drastically alter. Yes, and there were protests in the hundreds of thousands.
So it says hundreds of thousands march in Israel against Netanyahu's judicial overhaul.
Yeah,
and so you see this giant group of people waving Israeli flags, walking down the highway.
Now, from what they were saying, because I listened to it, like what a lot of these people leading the protests were saying, they were saying that this was in effect going to be the end of democracy in Israel. Now, I don't know if that's a little bit hyperbolic or not, but they certainly felt that way, and he was under enormous political pressure, and in a kind of tragic sense, he was somewhat rescued politically by October 7th.
So this is so whatever this overhaul was, it says Netanyahu postponed the final vote of the legislation that had been slated for Monday. In a national address lasting around 7 minutes, he said he would hold discussions and bring the legislation up for a vote sometime after lawmakers return from a recess at the end of April. So he knew it was horrifically unpopular with people, obviously.
Yes, and then this was
3 months of protests.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, this was a big deal, and in huge numbers. And so he now, Netanyahu, in response to this, for his own political survival, has allied now with people who are even to the right of the Likud party, because they were basically the only ones who supported this, and so it's in effect made him even more of a right winger.
Well, isn't that just always what happens? God damn.
Yeah,
that's just what always people they're always trying to get more control over the people. They're always.
That's the nature of
it seems like
governments.
he came like to the brink of signing that.
Oh, there's no question. I think he wanted to sign it. I think it's just that there was so much enormous pressure that he backed out of it. But then again, there's like the white pill, which is like the case for optimism,
right?
Is that
protests work?
Well, and not just protests, but just, I mean, protests can work at times, but also just if the percentage of the population is so against something, then many times it doesn't get done. Like the thing that I think gives me the most cause for optimism and hope is that there's a reason why the governments use propaganda on their own people. There's a reason why they propagandize us, and it's because at least they believe, and I think they're correct in this, that they can't do what they want to do unless we at least tacitly support it.
Yeah.
Or will accept it. And that you've seen this several times before. I've talked about it before on the show with you, where there are these instances where they try to push something, and it's just, there's so much resistance to it that they're just like, they kind of dip their toe in the water to see if maybe they float an idea, and then everybody's just like, no, we're not doing this. And then they go, okay, we're not going to do that now. And at the same time, while we have that dynamic, we're in a revolution in terms of the way people get ideas and stuff like that. I mean, you're a pretty gigantic part of that. But there is no longer this kind of monopoly control on the means of information that the American people or people of the world can receive now. And so we kind of I do think we have a tremendous opportunity. I mean, you can look around at everything that's going on that's really bad, and I know I focus on that a lot, but we have a tremendous opportunity now, unlike ever before, to kind of counter the propaganda of governments. And so I actually think there's a lot of hope for humanity. And then, AI will kill us all in a few years.
What
but
was
in
this?
the meantime,
the government is trying to, in some way, control things on social media. And what was the latest with the Biden administration? Because I know they've instituted some shit in Canada that freaks people out. And they're clearly trying to get regulatory power over internet content.
Yeah, well, they're
because it's against their narrative too often.
Yeah, well, they're pretty furious with your boy Elon for
buying an X.
He did. He really committed a crime against the establishment by saying that not every single social media platform now will be on board with the program.
Yeah.
But you see the way they're kind of coming after him.
Well, he kind of put his foot in his own mouth with that one.
With what?
With the Twitter thing exchange that he got in trouble for.
Wait, what?
The one they're saying that he's anti-Semitic.
Oh! What was that specific one?
Jamie will find it.
Oh! It was one. He responded to an anti-Semitic thing or something like that. Is that what it was?
And said you are saying the actual truth or something along those lines.
Okay. Yeah. I vaguely remember this. Yeah.
It's if you're shooting from the hip like that and saying things that are that's if you have like an explanation for what you're saying. Are you saying the what are you saying? The ADL? Like what is it?
Right.
What is the thing that you have a beef with? Yeah. Elon boosts anti-Semitic tweet, claims ADL and other groups push anti-white messaging. See, I don't, because I think the tweet said something about, I don't think it's specifically mentioned the ADL. So if it did specifically mention the ADL, then I would say, oh, he's talking about the ADL doing this thing. But I don't think that was exactly how the tweet was phrased.
Jewish communities have been pushing the exact kind of dialectic hatred against whites that they claim to want people to stop using against them.
Yeah,
okay,
see,
yeah, he said, yeah,
see,
so
it's
they
Jewish
didn't say
communities.
yeah.
He's not saying the ADL.
Right. Yeah, that probably wasn't a good response.
And then so Elon says, you have said the actual truth. So if he said the ADL has been pushing these things, then you could say yes. But he's saying Jewish communities. Is the ADL a Jewish community? Yes, it is. But you just can't lump them all into one group like that.
So, like, you could argue a case of on a technicality, like they are a Jewish community, but still, when you just say it that way,
that's such a blanket statement.
The most reasonable interpretation of that is not going to be that you're referring to the ADL. So,
Right.
yeah, I agree with you. He did put his foot in his mouth on that one. But also, to be clear, that's not really what their beef with him is. They saw this and then they go, oh, good, we'll use this one to get him. But they've had a beef with Elon Musk. When Elon Musk was doing nothing but just simply saying, I'm considering buying Twitter to make it a free speech platform, which was what he initially said.
Yeah.
They were furious at him for that. So, like, yes, it's true that was a bad tweet, and he was not clear with what I don't think he meant to say what it sounded like he was saying there. I mean, I don't know. But the point really is that they were furious at him already just for the gall of saying you were going to come make this a free speech platform when, as we know from the Twitter files, right, that it wasn't simply that Jack Dorsey was deciding he didn't want to hear anything that was skeptical about the COVID vax or lockdowns on his platform, but it was literally that the FBI, our federal government, political campaigns, three-letter agencies were telling Twitter, colluding with them, and making sure that, again, like I was saying before, that their government propaganda that they felt was necessary in order to institute these tyrannical policies of the COVID regime, that was not allowed to be dissented against on there. And that's what his real crime against them was buying Twitter, saying he's gonna make it a free speech platform, and releasing the Twitter files. That's really what got the establishment turned on Elon Musk, who, as you probably remember, was once a darling of these people.
Most certainly. But even if those things didn't take place and he was the CEO of Twitter and he quoted that tweet, it would still be
the ADL would probably still write a piece about him. Yes,
it would still be the equal problem.
Yeah, okay, that's fair.
That's just one of those things. Like if you have a specific, here's the other thing. I don't know how the fuck he even does what he does. Like, how is he tweeting while he's making rockets? How's he tweeting while he's running Tesla? So the amount of attention that he must be putting into each tweet has to be minimal.
Yeah.
It's not like he's like going over a very complex, nuanced subject and sitting there before he makes his tweet.
Yes.
He's got fucking people. Elon, what do we do with this? You want the tip of the rocket pointy like Spaceballs and, the fucking Cybertrucks? Do you want it 1,100 horsepower or 1,500 horsepower?
Well, I'm not nearly as busy as Elon Musk, and I don't think I have one like that, but I've definitely like replied to tweets before and then like realized I misread the tweet.
Right.
Like, and I was like,
100%.
oh, I misread that, and what I said I didn't actually mean. I wasn't agreeing with you. Oh no, I disagree with you. So it's like, it's not unforgivable. It's not like he tweeted something like that. He replied to somebody else saying, "Yeah, that's right."
Yeah.
But I agree with you. It was not good, and that will get you heat when you're that big and famous of a person,
especially
no matter what.
With what's going on.
Yeah.
So then he scores points on the other side by saying that, agreeing that phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," that is implying genocide, he's saying.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely people who say it, who mean that by it.
Have you seen people that get interviewed when they're chanting, and then these people interview them? Like, what do you mean by to which river and which sea? Like, what are you saying? And they're like, "What? Why are you asking me questions?" Like, I'm just trying to find out, like, what river are you talking about, and what sea does it go to?
Yeah, but dude, this is protests in general because I remember videos of the March for Our Lives when they were marching for gun control. And they had like these big protests up in Boston and stuff, and they'd go around interviewing them and just ask them, they'd be like, so, what is it what policy do you want? And they're like, we want a ban on assault weapons. They'd be like, what's an assault weapon? And then you already see them being like, well,
dude,
it's the scary ones.
Joy Behar was on The View talking about shooting a deer with an AR. There'd be nothing left of the deer. She
just have no idea. Just has no idea.
5.56 is small round.
Yeah.
ARs don't shoot a big round. It's not like a 300 Win Mag. It's not like a big rifle round. It's a fairly small round.
A huge percentage of these guys, because this is like so many times I've seen people make this mistake. A huge percent of them think the AR-15 is a machine gun. Like you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of them don't.
It just looks like a tactical gun, and there's some people that like don't like the idea of using it for hunting because it's a semi-automatic. But realistically, a semi-automatic is more ethical for hunting than a bolt-action rifle.
Right.
A bolt-action takes too much time to reload. So if you hit an animal and then you want to hit it again while you can still see it, you want to be able to go bang, bang.
Right.
You want to be able to get a second shot into that animal. It's more humane.
Right.
So it's really a very good gun, except for the round. The round is not like that heavy.
One of the real problems in the gun control debate is that, which kind of makes sense by the nature of it, but the people who are on the side of gun control tend to not like guns and not be around guns.
Right.
But then the problem is that you're having a debate about something that you just don't know anything about.
Sure, like saying that an AR-15 would be terrible. Like people kill deers with way bigger rounds.
Yeah.
Way
It's just a statement out of ignorance. Now, by the way, that's not a blanket statement for everyone. Like there are people who are for gun control who know a lot about guns, but generally speaking, the people who support that tend to be the ones who aren't around guns, don't know people with guns, live in blue cities where the only people who have guns are criminals and cops.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where you have an opinion, and that opinion is oftentimes just an opinion that you have adopted from your ideology. There's like a predetermined pattern of opinions and behavior that you've adopted. This is acceptable for my tribe.
Right.
And, when you say AR-15, you don't even have to know anything. You just tell people, oh, you're going to blow that deer to smithereens. There's going to be nothing left.
Yep. And then the major problem, and I think this is kind of like the fundamental libertarian insight, is that people remove themselves from what they're actually advocating for when they're advocating for like laws against things.
Right.
And so in a lot of people's minds, when they're advocating for gun control, what they're advocating for is like less mass shootings. Right. You know what I mean? Like that's what I want. I want less mass shooting, so here's how we get it. It's same thing when people advocate for criminalizing drugs or prostitution or whatever it might be. What they're advocating for their mind is like, I want less drug use or I want less of it. But what the reality is,
the nuance.
But the reality is, and this is what I mean by the libertarian insight, is that what you're actually advocating for is that men with guns throw human beings in a cage for the crime of possessing a gun. Not doing anything to anybody, not violating anybody's rights, but and in this country, all throughout this country, we have people who are sitting in cages for decades for the crime of just owning a weapon. Like in many cases for self-defense. In many cases, they were just doing it because they wanted to protect themselves. You could just have a gun and bring it across a state line, which in many cases people live right on the border and cross state lines all the time, going to work or going to a friend's house or something. And the crime of having that gun and bringing it over this state can land you like a 15-year jail sentence. And so even it's true with drugs and with all of this stuff. The real question when you're talking about writing laws against something shouldn't be like, how do you feel about that thing? It should be like, are you willing to throw another human being in a cage for that? And I think if you really ask yourself that and you're a decent person, you get to a place of like, the only thing that it would be morally acceptable to throw a human being in a cage for is a violent crime where somebody is victimized or some type of like property crime where you've like,
Some Bernie Madoff shit.
Well, yeah, I mean, because stealing from people, or just like burning somebody's house down, stealing their money from them. Because when you take somebody's property, that, like, it may not by the technical letter of the statement be a violent crime, but you have violated them in some sense. Like in a sense, like if you work all day and you make X amount of dollars for that, and then I steal X amount of dollars from you, I basically stole your day. Like I almost retroactively enslaved you for a day that you just worked for me against your will. So but outside of that, outside of like property crimes and violent crimes, there's just like, I just think there's no moral case that we should throw human beings in a cage over it, no matter how much you don't like their behavior or their actions.
Well, there's a lot of problems, right? One of the problems is that it's profitable to put people in cages.
That's for sure.
With everything in this world, when it becomes profitable, they figure out a way to justify whatever the fuck they have to do, whether it's lie about side effects or lie about the dangers of certain food additives or lie about the effect of pesticides or herbicides, whatever the fuck it is. They've always shown that they will find a way to justify even if it's the sugar industry bribing scientists to pretend that saturated fat is the problem.
Yep.
They'll find a way if money's involved. So if money's involved in that, why would it be any different? And it's not.
Well, right. So, and this is basically kind of the beauty of free market capitalism, which we have so distorted with this kind of giant crony capitalist system that we live under, is that in a free market, if there's no government involvement and you're in a free market, there's still all of those incentives that you're talking about. All these companies want to make as much money as possible, but what it kind of does is channel that into something where, like, all right, how do we make as much money as possible? Well, you got to make something that people really want to buy. Yeah. You got to make something that they really want. You know what I mean? And that, I'm not suggesting there can't be any corruption in that type of system, but once you get the government involved in it, now the way to make the most money is to force things on people. You get the government to write a rule, and now the people have no choice. And so these incentives that can somewhat exist in harmony with doing good for society in some conditions is now totally corrupted, right? Like it's totally. So even if you think about something with, like, let's say there's you have like the vaccine or a vaccine or something like that, and theoretically there's no collusion between the government and pharmaceutical companies, and you want to get people to take your vaccine. Well, you're going to have to, like, convince them that it's really good for them. You're going to have to sell them on, like, no, look at this data. Look at how much this reduced the rate of death from this. Look at all this great information about the vaccine. But if you have the government involved, then you're like, well, you know what? Just go lobby the government to make it mandatory. Then we'll rake in profits. That's so much more of a profitable direction to go. And so, all these things get corrupted, and particularly today, we just, the size of the U.S. federal government is it's the biggest organization in the history of the world. There's not even a close second.
And it's got survival instincts.
Yeah.
It doesn't want to give up ground. It doesn't want to give up power.
Well,
it wants to keep expanding. It wants more funding for its projects. It wants to hire more people to deal with something in an incompetent way. And it's not like the free market where if it's incompetent, like, there's going to be a competitor that comes along and does a better job, and you're going to lose the market. No.
Well, you ever look at if you look at, like, the list of the richest counties in America, and they're like, I forget the exact numbers. It's
all lobbyists.
Well, it's like 10 of they're all, not all, but the vast majority of them are right outside Washington, D.C. and right outside New York City. And so, like, what is that? Is that capitalism? Do you go to Washington, D.C. and you go, oh, there's more millionaires there than there are in any other part of the world in the suburbs around Washington, D.C.? Is that because there's great big factories and they're making so much stuff that everyone wants to buy? It's like, no, that's because our centralized federal government spends over $6 trillion a year. And where does that money go? It goes into all the people who are connected to government. And why is it outside of New York City? Is it because in New York City they have great big factories where they're making all the things that everyone wants? It's like, no. And that's not because of capitalism. That's because Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard, and now it's just this phony casino Wall Street money. So it's everybody, all the people at the top who are making all of this money, they're not making it. It'd be one thing if you're if you're like John D. Rockefeller before he went and colluded with the government, and you created Standard Oil,
Right.
and now there's this big oil company, and you're making the country richer by this. But they're not making the country richer. They're extracting wealth out of the rest of the population. It's all just extracted. I mean, literally, the federal spending is extracting wealth out of people by taxing them and then spending it, it's literally taking the money from people who work and giving it to politically connected people. And then the Wall Street money is just printing money and then making your dollar less valuable. So just in another way, extracting wealth from the people. And this is basically why we live in this populist moment right now where so many people are so freaking furious at the establishment because they're right to be.
They're right to be. It's a shit system. It's a shit, scary system that you can never beat if it gets to make its own rules.
Well, it's not what it's not what America was supposed to be.
It's so wild. The stock market is such a wild idea that it's based on confidence, and you bet on companies.
Yeah.
You're essentially betting on buying and selling, and you can wreck them and you can own them, and and there's people that just play that game. All they do is like chase after businesses, short businesses. You could short a country.
Yeah. No, it's pretty wild. It's pretty wild, and
It's the craziest gambling.
But this is also, like to go back to like Ron Paul stuff. This was like at the center of his campaign. I don't think anybody else outside of like the Libertarian Party will put up candidates who like talk about this stuff. But Ron Paul was the only one like in a major party who got like a huge amount of traction behind him. But where he was like, look, this is all like when you have a fiat currency system and you go off of any type of gold standard or anything that kind of limits the government's ability to just print as much money out of thin air as they want to, you get this thing where we live in a cycle of constant inflation. And this is something that people don't put that much thought into. Like, when you're talking to your grandma or something and she's like, in my day, a bottle of Coke was a nickel. Right. We just take that almost as like, yeah, well, that's how it works. Things over time get way more expensive. That's just how, because that's been so just how we've always experienced life, that it's just a given that everything's always going to be a little more expensive. And we may have a bad year where things are like 9% more expensive, and then maybe we'll have a better year where things are only 2% more expensive, but it's always going in this direction. Right. But that's not a law of nature. That doesn't just have to be that way. And in fact, if you looked at like from the year, say, 1800 to the year 1900, somebody talking to their grandparents would have had the complete opposite thing. They would have been like, oh my God, it was so much more expensive when I was young and now things are getting cheaper. And in fact, the natural tendency in a society that's developing, the natural pressure is for things to get cheaper. Because if you just think about it, right, like you get more efficient at making them. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like you get more efficient at making them. You can make more things with less manpower. That would naturally put a downward pressure on prices. But because the government keeps printing money, the value of the money goes down. And so we live in this system where things get more and more expensive. But then when you have that, right, and then you have all types of government incentives on top of that, right? So it's like, okay, first of all, if you just hold your money, because this is what people used to do many generations ago, was the idea of just saving your money. Mm-hmm. You save it. But if you just save your money today, Joe, you're a sucker because of this system, right? Like if you just hold your dollars, you're just losing money actively. So you got to be chasing interest. In order to just not lose money, you have to be chasing an investment. You know what I mean? You have to be like gambling on something. And so now, and then of course there's also other like tax incentives where like you can kind of defer taxes if you invest in things. And so you're kind of like pushed into, like, well, put it in your 401k, put it in this, put it in that, and then you won't. But just think about that like logically, aside from being really good for rich bankers, why would you think that it's a good, for like an average, say like couple who's just like working and making money, and they don't know anything about stocks and bonds and trading, exchange traded funds and what to invest in and what not. Why would you say that you should be working? No, you shouldn't be working and saving a little bit for your retirement. What you should be doing is gambling. You should always be gambling your money constantly. Isn't that sound financial advice? Gamble on something that you don't understand.
Right. And you've done no research on.
Yeah. Trust someone who works on Wall Street.
Do you remember that time about a year or so ago where banks started failing?
Mm-hmm.
Remember that? Remember how spooky that was?
Yeah.
Where banks started going under, and there was a real concern that it would cause a a cascade effect.
They were very, very concerned about that. Yeah,
And it didn't, but it got close, and we had never heard about that many banks. I mean, there was a savings and loan crisis. Remember when a bunch of those places went under?
Yeah.
I remember that. I found out about that because Vinny Pazienza, the boxer, lost a bunch of money in one of those.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like, I think his life earnings. I think he lost a shitload of money. Like, quite a few people have lost a lot of money in these fucking things. Where
Yeah.
banks go under.
Yeah,
Like, all of a sudden you lose everything. Like, what? You don't have my money?
Well, and
There's
of
no
course,
money.
in 2008,
Bye.
that was the big one,
Yeah.
in 2008, and they really set a precedent there with that kind of too big to fail line of logic, where if that's true, that the banks are too big to fail, and then you bailed all of them out, and now they're bigger than they were then they're really too big to fail now, right? So it kind of perpetuates this idea that the banking system, and everybody kind of knows this, the banking system is built on a house of cards. And it could collapse at any moment. And if it does, the federal government's going to have to come rob you of your money to give to a bunch of bankers again. That's our system. That's our financial system.
And the CEOs of those banks still got bonuses.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They all still got
They
bonuses.
said they had to give them bonuses, otherwise they would leave and go other places.
And it shows a real eroding of something completely different than the political system, just our culture, that there wasn't at least like enough shame of those people to just go, yeah, I'm gonna not take my bonus this year because I don't want to get dragged through the streets and killed by the citizens of this country. I don't want to feel like that. And it's not as if these people didn't already have tens of millions of dollars, like they really needed their bonus from this year, or like little Timmy isn't going to get his Thanksgiving
They want
turkey.
a yacht.
Yeah, it's like, no, I want a fifth yacht.
Yeah, I
like
want a
it's like
yacht.
that level.
Yeah.
But the whole banking system is it. What's the oh man, I'm gonna get this. What's the Christmas movie where they kind of go over fractional reserve banking? Is it It's a Wonderful Life? Or the one where they're like, where they all come into the bank, there's like a bank run and they want their money, and he's like, oh, but don't you see, your money's over here at Frank's farm, and then his money's over there, and that's how. But I can't remember which one it was, but anyway.
Was that It's a Wonderful Life? Is that what it was?
Yes, I think it was.
Was
It's a
it?
Wonderful Life. Oh, no, maybe not.
Old ass movie.
No, but
For
but
that.
it's an old one. But the whole system of fractional reserve banking is really kind of this fascinating thing, because everybody still kind of has in their mind that if you kind of have in your mind that the money in your bank account is your money and that you're holding it, that they're holding it for you.
Right.
But that's not right. That's not what's going on. And if you ever actually read the contract that you sign when you open a checking account, that's not what it is. It's more like you're loaning money to the bank and they owe that money to you. But they don't have to give it to you. You could, legally speaking, you could walk in tomorrow to a bank. I mean, no one actually walks up to a teller anymore.
It's a Wonderful Life isn't a Christmas movie. It's a banking movie.
Oh, yeah. So that is
Yeah.
the scene. I was right about that. Okay. But so you could walk into the bank tomorrow and your checking, account balance is whatever, say it's $5,000, and you could go, I'd like to take out $2,000, and they can say no. You can't have it. Now,
Right.
they owe it to you, technically, but they don't have to give it to you. They're not just holding it for you to give to you on demand. Now, the system hasn't collapsed, so they will give that to you today if you walk into a bank. But when
But if too many people come in and they want too much money,
well, they don't have it.
yeah.
Is the point. So when you open a bank account, and I don't know exactly what the reserve rates are now because I know they did change this during COVID, but for a while it was 10%. Was what the Federal Reserve set as the reserves that you had to put away. So when you come into your bank and you give them $100 to open a checking account, just to make it an easy number, they hold $10 and they loan out $90. And now, so they'll loan that money out, and so essentially they owe you $100. But the effect of this, right, is that now there's this guy. So let's say you open the account with $100. Now there's another guy who takes out a loan for $90, and you're now in the economy, and kind of like you think you have $100, and he thinks he has $90, but really there's not $190. There's only $100. That you get what I'm saying?
Right.
But now here's where it gets even crazier than that. This guy doesn't just hold his $90, he goes and puts it in the bank. And so the bank holds 10% of that money and then loans out 90% of that to somebody else, who then puts that money in the bank. And then they take 10% of, so when you actually look at the effect of it, there's like not nearly as much money in the bank as we all think we have in the world. So essentially, if everybody came into the bank, or even just too many people came into the bank and said, we'd like to withdraw our money, there's nowhere near enough money for them to give you. So inherently, the whole thing is kind of a house of cards.
It's like when you're going to a stadium and you try to use your cell phone, you realize there's no signal, even though you have 5 bars.
Right.
Because everyone's using their phone. So there's no signal for you. You
Right.
can't get online. You can't make a phone call.
Right, like this thing only works if we're not all trying to do it at the same time.
Exactly.
But if we do, then we're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Cell phone towers get overwhelmed. And they're fucked.
Yeah. And then you realize,
that
how much.
before, right?
Well, oh yeah, I have, dude. Even just the other like a week ago, I was on a flight where the just like the Wi-Fi was out, and so just like your phone's useless now,
Yeah.
you know. And it is such a weird feeling when you're just like, I guess I'll look on this TV thing now.
Disconnected.
Like it's like you're almost instantly zoomed into like 15 years ago or something
And if it
like
came
that.
back on, you'd be excited. Let me check what I got.
Yeah.
What's my
But
texts?
but there was something kind of, there is something kind of nice about it. About putting your phone away for a little bit and just doing the old thing.
Oh, yeah. No, something very nice about it. It's unfortunate, but we're moving in that direction further and further, and we're not coming back.
Oh, and there's no fighting it.
When we were talking earlier about the gun control argument, I think that is one of those other red and blue discussions where if you were on one side, you're like, we got to take all the guns away. And which is so crazy short-sighted. It sounds like a fucked up thing to say, but if things got way worse, it could protect you from tyranny. Like it's happened in the past. It's a real issue. And to think it's not a real issue is so crazy. It might not be a real issue with the current administration, but to give people more and more power as they acquire more and more power, and then you see what happens in other countries. That can happen here, kids. It can happen anywhere. It is a way human beings behave. But one of the things that is always stunning to me is this willingness, this desire to ignore the fact that almost all of these shooters are on psychiatric medications.
Yeah.
And if you bring that up, somehow or another you're a conspiracy theorist. We are literally talking about chemicals that alter the way your mind works. And there seems to be some connection, whether it's because only a crazy person would wind up being a mass shooter, maybe.
Right.
Maybe that's it. But the fact that there's no discussion of maybe there's a connection.
Can it be? It also might be because I don't know if we actually know this or like if you're drug testing these shooters after, but it could be also like being on this medication and then suddenly going off of the medication. Like it's hard to tell, but
Sure.
that's still a concern about the medication itself. Is
It's
that like
also-
how are you going to make sure this person isn't going off it if that's the issue?
Right, you can't control
there's-
it.
Right, and then but look, even on a lot of these like SSRI psychotropic drugs, they'll say in the disclaimer like side effects can be like depression, thoughts of suicide, things like this. Like there are we're messing with chemicals in your brains, and they're saying, well, for the most part, we think it makes people feel less depressed, but there are some people who it actually makes feel more depressed, and then they'll even put suicidal thoughts on there. And so you're like, are you telling me that it's a crazy leap to think that if a drug might make you have suicidal thoughts, it might make you have homicidal thoughts? Like, is that crazy to say? And
It's
then
not crazy to say at all.
And look, obviously, like what you're saying here is like there's kind of like a circular like aspect to the argument, because you could also make the point that you're like, oh no, the reason why so many of these mass shooters are on these drugs is because they're the type of people who would need these drugs.
Right.
But there's at least something to look at there where it's like, yeah, but is it possible that the drugs itself are making this worse? Because look, when it comes at least to the school shooting, stuff, we did not have this problem before. There was a time in American history when this just was not happening,
Right.
And it was a time before we had these drugs. So
Right.
there's at least raises the question of, is it possible that this is actually what's going on, and how exactly can it be that like through all of human history it was just wrong, and the truth is that children must be medicated, like children must be on drugs as they're being raised up, and it is criminal. It is criminal how quickly the vast majority of psychiatrists will just prescribe a little boy Adderall, or I think that's more popular than Ritalin now, or whatever the other one, that new one that's kind of like Adderall is now. They'll just put him on drugs. Like, hey, I can't sit still. Put him on drugs. Drug him. That, like, you're not even talking about like perhaps there is an argument to that there are certain people, I think, who need to be on medication. I mean, I've known people who have like a bipolar disorder, and like if they don't take this medication, they're going to be in a very bad place. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But the idea that just like every little boy who can't sit still needs to be drugged, that's just insane.
If you've paid attention to the relationship between pharmaceutical drugs and these salespeople, and then the doctors, and the cozy relationship that these people all have, then you realize, like, well, there's a lot of money to prescribing these drugs. And as disgusting as that sounds, people are willing to put people on drugs they may not even need, that could have detrimental effects if it can be profitable.
And I think one of the things, certainly I learned this in a very personal way over the last few years, and I think probably a lot of people listening did too, is that a lot of doctors are, let's just say, totally reliant on whatever the institutions say, and they will then come out in their white coat and be like, I totally recommend this medication. And it's just because one of these major institutions said it, they're trusting them. They have not done their own independent research on this at all. I'm not sure if it's like how many cases it's because they're corrupt and it's profitable for them to do this, or how many of the cases they've just kind of like accepted that the experts they themselves have accepted, like the experts have figured this out. And so it doesn't hurt that I'm making money off of this too, but I'm going to tell you to do this. But I had this experience with doctors telling me to not only telling me to get the COVID vaccine, but telling me to give it to my little children. Starting with my boy was only a little over 6 months when they were telling me to give him the COVID vaccine. And then I'm arguing with the doctor about it, and I'm dominating him in the argument. Like, he hasn't read half the shit that I've read about this, and he has no response to like the points that I'm bringing up. And it's just very eye-opening to be like, damn, man, like I always just kind of trusted that my doctor knew more about medicine than I do. And if he's recommending something, it's because he's looked into it and knows that this is a, wise recommendation.
There's a lot of good doctors. And
For sure.
There's a lot of doctors that are not paying attention and don't give a fuck and are just working and shuffling patients in and out of their offices, and they're in debt. And then on top of that, they're probably medicated. The people that I know a couple people that are doctors that are shockingly medicated. Like, they'll tell me that they're on this and that and that and this and this one for that and that one for this. This is a mood stabilizer. Like, whoa.
Yeah.
So are you just like experimenting? Are you like going to your friend who's also a doctor and saying, let's try that out, let's try this out?
Well, it's crazy.
If you're just prescribing medication to people, wouldn't it be even normal for you just to be taking a bunch of medication?
Yeah, well, I guess so. But dude, I know a lot of people. I'm sure you do too. I bet everyone listening to this knows somebody I know people who have like gone to therapy the first time, had a 45-minute session, and it ends with a prescription being put in their hand. Like, they've talked to this person for 45 minutes, just haven't even gotten to know them at all. You know what I mean? And just ends with the like, here, this is what you're on now. We're going to try around with this. And to me, that sounds crazy. By the way, I should say, just because the point you made, and you're, like when you said there are a lot of good doctors out there, I totally believe that too. Yeah. And doctors saved my son's life. And those doctors are like those doctors and nurses are like the greatest people I've ever met in my life, and I owe them everything I have. Like, I owe them my house and my everything.
There's amazing doctors.
So I do. I'm not like trying to like say there aren't these amazing people. Particularly, what's touched my life the most is like pediatric cardiologists and cardiac surgeons and stuff like that are freaking incredible. NICU nurses are literally the best group of people I've ever met in my entire life. So I'm not like trying to disparage the entire medical community. It's just that there are so many like of your kind of family doctors, pediatricians, things like that, who will just tell you to give your kids the COVID vax when there's no solid argument for that. And way past the point when there even could have been an argument for that.
On top of that, they fired those nurses that weren't willing to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
Even the ones that had COVID. and got through it.
Even the ones who were really good at TikTok dances.
They
all got out. They all got out.
They fucking knew.
Yeah.
They knew that it imparted natural immunity. And they're like, no, you got to be a part of the marked team.
Yeah.
You got to get marked.
Well, and
You got to be on the good side.
The craziest thing about that was that many of these nurses at the point, right? Because when they were firing them was already well into 2021. I mean, it must have been like in the summer of 2021 when that started happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so these people had been working around COVID positive people since at the latest January of 2020.
They went through the worst of it when there was no treatments available.
So 100% of these nurses had either had COVID and gotten over it or figured out how to protect themselves from getting COVID by being, like super careful with, like N95 masks and washing their hands and stuff.
That, it's probably their antibodies. It's probably their system that fought it off.
Yes, but I'm just saying none of them have not figured out how to work under the conditions of the reality of COVID-19. And so to then at that point, and it was just what was amazing about it, and it shows you a little bit about how the propaganda machine works, is that the propaganda starts with, and this happened several times throughout COVID, right? Where the propaganda starts being, oh, the nurses are the heroes. Every day at 6 p.m. in New York City, we're going to open our windows and clap for them while we're all locked down because they're the healthcare workers and they're really on the front lines of this battle. And then as soon as you're not compliant with the latest requirements of the regime, your life's ruined.
Yeah,
We'll
because
end your
there's
livelihood.
no room for nuance. There's no room for, oh, you've had it, then you don't have to get it, because then you're going to sell less vaccines.
Right.
It's
Right.
really that simple.
But there's also no loyalty to the weren't they our heroes last year? And they're like, nope, they're not helping the current agenda. But you saw that a lot with you can hear Fauci talking in 2020 about how we're never going to get a vaccine, and even if we get a vaccine, it's going to take a decade before we'd know it'd be safe, and so blah, blah, because he was trying to sell the lockdown regime at the time. And so he was saying no, don't think there's going to be something that gets us out of all of this. We have to lock down. That's the only way to do it. But then as soon as that switched, and it was like, okay, now the plan is to push the vaccine, it was like, no, you have to get the vaccine. Everybody has to get that. No questions. Don't think about it. Mm-hmm. Don't do your own research. I'm your own research.
Yeah. Do you see what they're doing with soldiers? So, they fired a lot of soldiers who weren't willing to take the COVID vaccine, and now they're inviting them back.
Yeah. Well, they're having a big recruitment issue in the military, yeah.
Well, how many fucking videos do you have of some Navy sailor who is doing a TikTok and he turns into a woman and dances around where you're like, what? Aren't you in the Navy?
Yeah.
Shouldn't that shit be not what you're broadcasting? This is what are you doing? You doing this for attention?
Yeah, you would.
What?
You
What's
also,
going on with the Navy?
You also would think, and I'm not inside the minds of everybody who joins the military, but I feel like that isn't what most of them get in it for. You know what I mean? That would probably turn off a lot of these young brave boys who want to join the military to protect the Bill of Rights and defend our country and make sure your sister doesn't get attacked by a terrorist or something. And they're not really the wokest amongst us. And that might win you some points in Portland. But I don't think that most of the kids from rural Texas or Alabama who want to sign up to enlist in the military, they might be a little bit dissuaded by that culture.
I think you're going to turn them away. Oh, shit, the fucking military's gone woke too.
Yeah.
It's a Bud Light thing for the military.
Yeah.
The military went Bud Light.
But it is, look, dude, the COVID stuff and the woke stuff, it all does just it's if you just try to step out of a little bit of it and just observe what's going on, it's kind of easy to just be we're living through a moment of national insanity.
Yeah.
Let's hope this passes. But this is craziness that for almost anyone else of any other generation, it would be very easy to describe exactly what you're seeing right now. You'd be like, oh, this is insanity.
Well, it's the first time ever where propaganda has encountered new media.
Yeah.
It's the first time ever. So everything seems so insane. And if you're a person that's always gone 100% mainstream news, that's it. You have narratives in your head. I know a lot of older people They have like very specific CNN or Fox News narratives in their head.
Yeah, well, dude, this is really, to me, very revealed with Israel, with the war going on over there right now, where you see that there's this huge generational gap where it's like the older generation is like, no, I know what I know about this is this, and I've always known that. It's like the story here is that Israel just wants to exist, and then these crazy barbaric Arabs just want to kill them, and that's it. But you see amongst the younger generation a lot more of an understanding of that's not the entire story. Now, I'm not saying they get everything right either, but they at least know that like that's not the whole story.
Right.
But look, like,
because of people like you that just laid it out, and here's the best thing about it: too many people believe that their side is correct and there's a solution. If you really look at the whole thing, you go, boy, that is insanely complicated, and it's got such a history of horrific violence now. And one of the other things I forgot to ask earlier, the origin of, like, when it was, what was it originally before it was Israel? Like, what was it named? Like, what's the history of that land?
Well,
was it ever a Jewish state before?
I don't think a Jewish state, but like in biblical times,
right.
like the Jews like lived there.
Right.
But in the more like recent history, so before it was the Ottoman Empire ruled it for hundreds of years.
Right.
And it was called Palestine, but it was under the control of the Turks, of the Ottoman Empire. And so that was like, I think for 400 years or something like that, they controlled the area. And then so basically Zionism starts in the late 1800s. This is when the first Zionist writers start, and it starts mostly by or maybe exclusively, but definitely mostly by Eastern European Jews. And Zionism was a reaction, in my opinion, a very understandable reaction to the pogroms, which, like, dude, if you ever want to not be able to sleep at night, go read about the history of the pogroms. It's the most disturbing thing in the world.
I'm not aware of it at all.
Okay, so basically there would be over and over and over again, there were waves of what you would just describe as kind of state allowed, in some cases state sanctioned, just waves of mass violence against Jewish people in Eastern Europe. And if you think like the like if you're in the dark recesses of the internet and you see some like anti-Jewish conspiracy, and you might kind of like roll your eyes at it and be like, this is pretty stupid. But the stuff back then, it was like a virus would come in and they would accuse the Jews of practicing black magic. And that's why everyone's getting sick from this virus. So, like, try arguing your way out of that one. You know what I mean? Like,
what year is this? What time period?
This is happening all throughout the 1600s, 1700s, and into the 1800s. There are waves of it over and over again. And it's like, I mean, I'm talking about where, like, they would just storm Jewish areas and, like, literally the stuff that'll give you nightmares. I mean, it's like just rip your baby apart in front of you, rape your wife, make you watch, and then beat you to death afterward. And this happened over and over and over again. And so the early Zionists were basically like, we can't live like this anymore. Like, we can't live with this just like waiting for the next pogrom to happen. So we're not doing this anymore. And what we need is a Jewish homeland. And that was kind of their conclusion. And you can totally see where that's a totally reasonable conclusion in the face of that type of violence. Now, there were lots of other Jews who disagreed with them. There were lots of Jews. In fact, at the time, the only opponents of Zionism were Jews, because they were the only ones who knew about this plan anyway. It was only a small group of people. But they were kind of like, well, no, you're giving in to the same anti-Semitic narrative that we're trying to fight. Like, because they'd be saying things like, look, we are different and we need to remove ourselves from society. And they're like, no, that's what they're saying. We disagree with that. We just want to be, members of the society we live in, and we just want our like equal rights. But anyway, the Zionists took off. One of the things that's really interesting, if you read the early Zionist writings, they did not talk much about Arabs. This is something Darryl Cooper did a really good job of covering in his series, by the way. But they were not talking about Arabs. They very rarely mentioned them. It was like they kind of picked Israel because that was the place in their holy book. You know what I mean? And that was like the history of, this is where we started in Israel. Like, those are our holy sites. But none of the early Zionists had been to Israel. Or Palestine at the time. They had never been to this area. They were just like, this is the one in our holy book, so like, let's do it there. And they don't talk much about Arabs. When they do, they speak of them in pretty friendly terms. They liked the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a lot cooler to the Jews than the Russian Empire, where most of these Jews lived. And they liked them. The Ottoman Empire tended to let Jews practice their religion and work and stuff like that. And so their enemy was Europeans. That's in the early Zionist writing. The bad guy is the Europeans who keep oppressing us. And then they're like, look, like they basically started organizing to like, let's get people to go move to Palestine and start a life there. And over the years, they started to gain some influence over like some really wealthy Jewish financiers to kind of like back this.
This is in what time period?
It starts in the late 1800s, and then it kind of gets going in the first, say, like 15 years of the 20th century. They start building a little bit of momentum. They start raising more money. More Jews start settling in Palestine, and things were relatively peaceful there for the beginning. There were incidents here and there, but like relatively speaking, the Jews who lived in Palestine, there were Arab Christians and Arab Muslims, and they lived there, and it wasn't like a disaster. And then things started getting much worse during and particularly after the First World War. So in the First World War, the Ottoman Empire goes to war with the British Empire. And there were others involved as well. But the Ottomans and the British Empire are fighting each other. And it's the First World War. There's never been anything like it before in human history. It's the biggest war at the time ever. And it was very in doubt who was going to win. I mean, like the German military was, I think, viewed as the toughest at the time. Certainly their subs were like way more advanced than the other countries in there. And Britain is pretty desperate at this point. So the British, they cut a deal with some of the Arab nations. So the Arabs are being ruled by the Ottoman Empire at this point. So the British convince them to rise up and fight against the Ottoman Empire. And then they say, if you do that, we'll grant you your independence when the war is over and we've won. But then at the same time, they also released the Balfour Declaration, this is in 1917. This is in the middle of World War I. And they write this Balfour Declaration to the Rothschilds, who were like a crazy rich, powerful banking family, and because they were Zionists. And so they write this letter, or they were pro the Zionist cause. And so he writes this letter that says like, it pleases the king that there should be a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So, but he also said in the declaration that with respect to the rights of the non-Jewish people there. This is kind of vague, but it was kind of like the king basically saying like, hey, Rothschilds, we could really use some money for this war. So here's like a declaration that like will support a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And then they also promised the French Syria when the war is over. So they basically were just promising anyone whatever they can if you help our war effort. And it's just like, we got to win this war. We'll figure it all out after that. So then after the war, there's all of these different groups who kind of feel entitled to it because they were promised. And so the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire collapses after the war. They lose. Then the British Empire takes control. And they take control from the end of World War I up until 1947. And so the land was, under the control of European empires for hundreds of years. But if you ask me, that's not really what counts. Like, what really counts is like who was living there. I've heard, again, like Ben Shapiro kind of talk about this before. I've heard Laura Loomer, who I just debated last week for Zero Hedge. And they'll both say, they'll use this, they'll be like, there's no such thing as Palestine. And there never was a thing as Palestine, and basically what they're saying is that there was never an official government, that this is the state government of Palestine. It's just a word people use to refer to this strip of land. So they don't have like a right to it because they never had like their government there. But to me, it's just like, I don't know, that's the most un-American way of looking at things. All you got to do is read our Declaration of Independence to know that that's complete bullshit. It doesn't matter if that's not what counts. It doesn't matter if you had a government there. Just read the Declaration of Independence, and that wipes all of that away. Sorry, here's the deal. We're free because God says so. That is self-evident and doesn't need any more explanation than that. That's literally how the Declaration of Independence starts, right? We determine that it is self-evident that God gave us freedom. So no argument about that. We're free people. And governments are just this thing that man institutes to protect our freedom. And you know what? If they're not doing a good job, we have every goddamn right and maybe even a duty to overthrow them and create a new one. So that destroys that case right there. These people are there and they deserve natural rights just like everybody else does. And so anyway, the things after this, after the Balfour Declaration and after World War I are when things start to get really, really tense.
Hold that thought. I got to pee.
Sure.
So we're going to come back. We're going to come back from World War I.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, we're back. World War I.
Okay. Well, we were at, I think, after World War I,
Yes.
right? So there's a little interesting detail of history that I always found that's really fascinating. And so I'm going to give Daryl Cooper credit for this because I knew about this, but I totally missed this aspect of it. And I think, yeah, he covered it in one of the episodes. But so there was after World War I, there was this commission set up called the King Crane Commission, and it was run by the Americans. I believe, if I'm not mistaken on this, double check me, people who are listening on this, but I believe initially the English and the French were supposed to be on board with it too, but they pulled out, and it just ended up being the Americans, which is really a shame because it probably would have held more weight if they had stayed in it. But so the King Crane Commission basically was assigned to go on basically a fact-finding mission to the Arab world because they're trying to figure out what we're going to do with these countries now. Like the Ottoman Empire used to rule them. They've collapsed. The mentality there too was, this is like, it's a pretty colonial mentality too, where it's like, obviously these people can't rule themselves. So like, what are we going to do? Who's going to figure it out? So they go to Syria and Palestine, and they basically just interview thousands of people. Interview thousands of people trying to figure out what's going on, what people want. I knew about this because one of the details that I always found really fascinating, which I learned from Tom Woods, who's a brilliant historian, has an amazing podcast, The Tom Woods Show, that in the King Crane Commission, Syria overwhelmingly wanted the United States of America to be. They asked him, what country would you like to rule over Syria under a League of Nations mandate? And they overwhelmingly wanted the USA. And I just find that to be an interesting thing because it really kind of destroys the whole they hate us for our freedom, narrative. It's like, actually, no, before we started conducting wars in this part of the world, they loved us for our freedom. They liked that we were viewed as we weren't the imperialist country, right? Like, you don't want the English or the French. Those guys are jerks. But the Americans, they're all about limited government and freedom, right? That was the perception of us before. This is World War I. We're not like the empire yet. So I always thought that detail was interesting. But either I read and forgot, or I never read the part that they come back about the Zionists. And they come back to Woodrow Wilson and they say point blank that they're just like, look, this thing in the Balfour Declaration about like the idea of a creation of a Jewish state that also respects the political and civil rights of the Arab population is just not going to work out. And that it's going to take an overwhelming amount of force to do this. They said they think it's going to be an army of 50,000 people in order to force these, like Arabs out and create some type of Jewish state, and that it's really going to be and he says to Woodrow Wilson, they say, Mr. President, you should know that if you side with the Zionist project here, you're committing not only yourself, but all Americans to the use of force against these people in order to create this state and in order to maintain it. And Woodrow Wilson, shortly after that, has a stroke, and this advice just doesn't, get taken or anything like that. But so that's that's in the immediate aftermath of World War I. Then the British take it over. They rule it through World War II. And then this is where... So before World War II, say in like the 1920s, the Zionists are not having that much success. They're a tiny percentage of the population over in what is Palestine, what is today Israel. And they're living there, but this this call for all Jews around the world to move there is really not going good because it's a totally new world now. And there were a lot of Jews who were very involved with the Bolshevik Revolution. And so now it's not the Russian Empire anymore. This is the Soviet Union. And the Jews, and again, I'm not saying any conspiracy like it was the Jews who did communism. But there were Jews involved in it. Lots of them weren't at all. But Jews now are like given positions in government, and their religious freedom is like being respected at this point. Stalin later turns on the Jews, but at this point he's cool with them. So that problem isn't really happening with pogroms in Eastern Europe anymore. This is the Roaring 20s now, right? So Jewish people in England, Jewish people in New York City, they're doing pretty good. So this call of like abandon your country, forget everything you have ever known to go live in a desert, just isn't resonating with people. And the Zionists are very adamant that they're like, no, you don't understand. This is the calm. But another storm's coming because another storm always comes, Like they're just, you think you're being accepted into this society now, but wait and see. You're going to regret your decision to not leave and come here. And then you have the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s and then the Holocaust in the 1940s. And so the Zionists were kind of proven right in a massive way. Like, see, we warned you, and now look at you. Look what happened, And so this has, after World War II particularly, there's a huge, influx of Zionist settlers into where Palestine is now. So now they start actually getting their numbers up to where they could, be like have a chance at actually creating their own state. And then that takes us kind of to what I led with. I guess I did this kind of backward here, but then start to 1947 when the British dropped the whole thing, and then into them taking over control of 80% of the land, and then 100% of the land, and then all the way up to today. And so anyway, all of that to get back to like October 7th is it's like, that was like a horrifically brutal attack, and it's just like it's like unfathomable. And I know they, a lot of people do compare that to the pogroms, or call that a pogrom, but there is like, it is a different situation than what was happening in Eastern Europe to Jews. It's a different situation than what happened under the Holocaust. It's What was the original hatred from? The original hatred in Eastern Europe? I think there was a lot of anti-Semitism. I'm not exactly sure in that culture what it was that they blamed the Jews for. I think that the Jews were a distinct minority who had a different religion and different traditions and kind of like, you know what I mean? And I don't know. I'd have to read into that more, like what the stated grievances were. But I'm telling you that I know one of them was that when viruses were going around, they'd blame the Jews for practicing black magic. And so I do think some of them were just on that goofy level of it was just like tribalist hatred. Did you ever see that really old cartoon where at one point in time it was like a Jew dressed as a wolf? Oh, what was that? Like a Nazi? Or a wolf dressed as a Jew? No, it was like fucking like an old Mickey Mouse cartoon. Oh, yeah. I don't know if I've seen this one. I can't remember but there was some. Look at this. Oh, yeah. Wow. It's a wolf dressed as a Jew. Look at this. Thank you. Now I got you. So, no, it wasn't a wolf. Yeah, see, there it is. So it was the wolf pretending to be a Jew. Yes. Oh, I took that all the wrong way at first. I thought it was a Jew pretending to be a wolf. No. Now I get it. A wolf with a Jew mask on. But how crazy is that? And this is 1933. Yeah. How wild is that? Yeah, it is. It is pretty wild to see. Three Little Pigs, 1933, the Jew peddler scene. Now, didn't they change it in the future? I think in the future they redid it, and they turned it into just a wolf. Yeah, so this is the one on the right, see? What?
It's the cleaned up version. They stopped having it be a
Oh,
Jew. It
okay,
had to be
yeah,
a
yeah,
wolf
yeah.
pretending to be a person.
That was the first iteration of wokeness. Was they were like, yeah, we can't really get away with that Jew thing anymore.
Isn't that wild?
It is pretty wild. You know what's wild about like that time when you see like the propaganda that was for adults, clearly at that time, but it would be cartoons. Have you ever seen the one? There's the one where it's Daffy Duck. Not is it Daffy Duck? Or wait, I'm confusing the two ducks. It's one of those ducks, but it's a whole like pay your taxes.
I think
thing.
Is it Donald?
Yes, Donald Duck.
Yeah.
Sorry, I always get those confused. And I got little kids. I should be better. on
And then
this.
there's the one duck that's like really rich. Who's the one
that
duck?
was Scrooge McDuck. I
Yeah,
believe.
Scrooge
Yes.
McDuck.
Uncle Scrooge.
Uncle Scrooge.
That's right. Yeah, he
That's
was his
right.
uncle, right? But do you ever see the one I'm talking about where it's like pay your taxes?
I do believe
It's
I
this
see.
one.
Yes, let me see that.
Might be confined
Disney
by
war
the version.
propaganda.
Let's
Well,
try
let's
this one.
Donald Duck versus taxes.
There's just
Here it goes.
the video looks shitty.
Wow. 1943.
Yes, payday. Millions of dollars pouring into the hands of the American worker. Now, in the mind of the average worker live two separate personalities. One, the thrifty.
Scrooge.
Wait a bit, laddie. You're going to save a bit of that, aren't you?
Oftentimes, idle money burns a hole in your pocket, which brings out the other personality. The spendthrift.
Look at this. He's a pimp.
Hi, big shot. Come on with me. I'll show you how to spend your dough. I got a couple of good dates.
But, laddie, I've got some better dates.
Important ones, too. When every American should pay his or her income tax gladly and proudly. This year, thanks to Hitler and Hirohito, taxes are higher than ever before. Will you have enough money on hand to meet your payments when they fall due?
We'll take care of that later. Forget it.
Keep watching.
forget it.
But you don't want to forget our fighting men, do you?
No, sir.
Then you'll have to start saving right away to meet your tax payments.
Listen, chum. Spend it.
Yeah, it goes on, I think, for a while. But isn't it like, is it crazy this is for grown-ups?
Yeah.
You must save for victory.
What's money for? Spend it. Shoot the works.
Nay, nay.
Wow.
You must save it. Spend.
He's trying to get him into the Idle Hour Club. Oh, look, it's a Nazi swastika.
You see? And that's what happens when you don't give your taxes.
You go through the Idle Hour Club. It's a swastika for a front door.
No, well, you didn't pay your taxes.
what the-
Support your boys.
Look, he's got swastikas in his eyes.
They made him look like Hitler
Oh my God, they gave him a Hitler mustache
in the little swoop.
and a swastika for a tie. Oh my God, this is crazy.
And then how, like,
Well, you know, it was pretty easy to distribute propaganda back then.
yeah, you could make cartoons for grown-ups, and that would convince them?
Look
Like
what
it-
they did with Reefer Madness.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Reefer Madness in, what is it, the 30s when they put that out?
I think
that
so, yeah.
fucked people up for 100 years.
I know. It's amazing that it says something about how different our culture is, though, that like that type of propaganda would work back then and how much more sophisticated it has to be today. You know, like it was like
Yeah.
a simpler time
Well, now
when
it's a
that would
comedy.
get you. Yeah.
If you
yeah.
watch Reefer Madness now, it's a comedy. Like a thing that was meant to terrify you is now unintentionally hilarious.
Yeah, and just imagine like if people if someone from like say like you took someone from the 1930s and just showed them like an action movie today, like a high def action movie, they'd be like, "What in the world is
Right.
this?" Like they would
Right.
just blow their minds. You know
Show
what I
'em
mean?
Fast and the Furious
Yeah, like
15 or whatever it is.
Or you like they're
Yeah.
used to a movie where it's like, see now, yeah, we got a dame coming, and then like you just showed them this, it'd be like just.
Isn't it also interesting that we accepted a certain very specific way of talking that is completely unnatural for a narrator to be explaining what is happening to Donald Duck?
Yeah,
Like a weird fucking DJ voice thing.
I was watching recently with my daughter the original Frosty the Snowman movie, and the movie just opens with some guy is just like it was the first snow of the season, and all frosty had come up. You know what I mean? And it's just such a. I actually found it kind of great because I was like, this is just such a lost like thing. I'm kind of glad she's seeing this. You know what I mean? Because it's just such a different time and a different. You know what I mean? Like a different voice and like it's very strange. It's kind of cool in a way. I'm interested in that time period.
Well,
I mean, not
it's
so
a
much
time
the pay your
capsule.
tax propaganda. That part I don't like.
But Frosty the Snowman.
But Frosty was cool.
Yeah.
That guy was all right.
The Freeze Meister. Remember that dude?
I'm thinking, how would you have seen this in 1943 when it came out? Like
Probably the movie theaters.
Like before something. Like it just
Yeah.
they played a bunch of shit. Like,
I'd imagine it'd be theaters.
They would play the news in movie
Right.
theaters.
That's
So you'd go to the movie theater and they would show you what is going on in World War II, Allied troops. They would show you like, footage.
But you talk about how easy it would be to just capture the narrative completely back then. You know,
sure.
like it was.
False flags. They were so easy to pull off.
Yep.
Look at the Gulf of Tonkin.
No,
so easy to pull off.
Yeah, they would get away with a lot of that stuff. And then look, it's obviously World War One. Like to me, World War One is the big one. I think Woodrow Wilson's the worst president in the history of the United States of America. He did more damage to just the entire world and particularly our country. Is the guy, like I hate him because he created the Federal Reserve and the income tax, or signed them into law in his administration. But he's the one getting us into World War One, and this is why my thing isn't like, oh, I blame Israel for everything or I blame the Jews for everything. I blame Washington D.C. for everything. Like I mean, again, not everything. Bad things happen in the world, but there's so much responsibility on the U.S. federal government because basically World War One was a war that we never should have been involved in. It had nothing to do with us. It was a war between European monarchies. You know what I mean? Battling over who runs the world. And all of the advice of all of our founding fathers was like, that's exactly why we're here to not be a part of that, right? Like if you read anything that Adams or Thomas Jefferson or George Washington said about foreign policy, it was all like, that is what you do not do. Do not get into entangling alliances between these despots. That's not what we're here for. What we're here is to be a city on a hill, to have free people. Short as they may have fallen of that vision, the whole slavery thing was a pretty big one, but regardless, that was what they said. And then World War I comes along and it's like textbook, like, yes, don't get involved in this. And the war was basically fought to a stalemate before America got involved. And then America got involved and tipped the balances over, so much so that not only was it not a stalemate anymore, but they got an unconditional surrender out of the Germans. And then because they got this unconditional surrender, they forced the Treaty of Versailles on the Germans and totally devastated Germany and humiliated them in front of the world. And then that's the ground by which the Nazis rise up. And then that's the ground by which we're in a second world war. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then these two things, the First World War and the Second World War, they're just the biggest bloodbaths in human history. Just goddamn horrific. I mean, you think if we think now, oh, it's kind of depressing how bad things are going in this area or this area. I mean, man, nothing is like the two world wars that we fought in the 20th century.
Nothing.
Just nothing. Just people by the tens of millions dying. I mean, just to put in perspective, and this assault on Gaza is pretty damn awful. And what are the estimates? Like 10,000 people died there. It's horrific. And I don't know if those numbers are exactly right or not. A lot of that does come from Hamas, so I don't know. But a lot of people are dying. Thousands of people are dying for sure.
For sure.
But by the tens of millions, people were dying in the world wars. And it's just like, it's on a level you can't even fathom.
Right, but the real fear is that could escalate again, and then we could have something like that again. And it's much more scary now.
Well, yes, but the prospect of a world war is we have, much more power and much more devastating military weapons than we ever did. So yeah, you really want to avoid one now even more than you wanted to avoid it there. But I mean, basically, I'd say that it's just like, right. And look, when you say there's the threat of it spreading to a wider conflict, there's no question about that. I mean, you got Hezbollah right there in Lebanon. They're a strong fighting force, man, and they really hate the Israelis because Israel occupied them for a while, and they successfully drove Israel out of southern Lebanon. And you've got Iran, of course, who the Israelis have hated for years, and they hate them right back too. And there's been a whole bunch of people in Washington, D.C. who have been dying for a war with Iran for a long time now. I mean, they wanted that war in Iran under George W. Bush. They didn't get it. But this was, if you know, we always go back to that Wesley Clark, the plan of all the countries they were going to topple. Iran is the last one. And they say that. He says that specifically, ending with Iran. Like, that's the goal, you know?
Yeah.
And so you have them in the region. You have, you know, the Saudis in the region. You know, there's all but the Houthis now who are flirting with joining into this conflict against Israel. So there's a whole, like, possibility for this to spread to a wider war. And I just think that it's like the response so far from Israel and the response from the U.S. government of basically saying, yeah, we're going to back them no matter what they do, is the most dangerous way to handle this, because you are really now risking this thing escalating and getting out of control. And if you want an actual solution to this, the only way to actually do it is you just got to let these people go. You just got to let them be free. And I'm not saying that I'm not like some type of hippie on this. I'm not saying that like there should be no violence as a response to October 7th. I mean, obviously, Israel has every right after that to try to kill those people who came and did that to them. I think first you try to negotiate all the hostages out, which there is some attempt to being done right now. But they have every right to like find those people and kill them. But you should do it in a way that absolutely leads to the least amount of civilian casualties possible, and not talking this rhetoric about flattening Gaza, doing whatever it takes to get rid of Hamas, which is like, what does that even mean? What would it take? Like, how many tens of thousands of babies got to die in order for you to do that? And that's a much different thing than just saying, like, the people who did this attack, you know what I mean? Like, that we're going to flatten all of Gaza. Those are very different things. But the reality is that people make, you know, like I was debating this Laura Loomer lady, and she's saying to me the whole time, basically, it's like George W. Bush stuff. It's like, oh, it's radical Islamic terrorism, and the problem is Islam, and the problem is that they're just so crazy and they're just so barbaric, and they just hate us for our freedom, and so you can't give them their freedom because blah. And it's like, look, man, if the problem is just radical Islam, well, there's a big issue with that, right? And it's that Israel has had peace with Egypt since the 1970s. Israel has had peace with Saudi Arabia. Israel has had peace with Jordan. Israel, all of these surrounding like Arab countries haven't gone to war with Israel for decades, you know? And what you didn't tell me, there's not a radical Islam problem in Egypt? You think there's not a radical Islam? How about Saudi Arabia? You know what I mean? Like there are plenty of issues with radical Islamists in those countries, but they're not constantly going to war with Israel. And part of that's because Israel doesn't occupy them. You know? Like they have the issues that Israel has been in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah, and in Gaza with Hamas, and with years ago some terrorists in the West Bank. This is all the areas that they occupied, you know? And so like the only answer here is to just like let these people go, let them have their freedom. Do whatever you can to like targeted operations to take out the people who are responsible for October 7th, but you got to really offer them a deal, and not like the deals that they pretended to offer them in the past. Because I know that's the other narrative too that Ben Shapiro types like say all the time is we offered them everything. We offered them everything they wanted and they said no, which just on the face of it should sound a little ridiculous to you. How many negotiations do you know that go that way? Right. Here's everything you want. No. I'll continue to be occupied. Like, what? This is ridiculous. And
so what is the solution? Like, is there a solution in terms of like a percentage of land that you have to get back to them?
Yeah.
And creating a different relationship?
I think that
And is that even possible? If Hezbollah exists, is that even possible?
Well, Hezbollah is over in Lebanon.
I'm sorry.
So Hamas.
If Hamas even exists, is that even possible?
Well, look, I mean, right now, obviously, like they're in the middle of a war. And so this is, you know, but I'll say this. When Arafat, who was the leader of Palestine for a while there, when he came to the table, and even what Hamas, like I mentioned this earlier, even what Hamas has said in the past, is that they agree to recognize Israel in 67 borders. Then the 67 borders are referring to before the war in 1967.
1967 borders.
Yes. So what they refer to when they say that is, you know, when I said the UN recommended the Jews get 56% of it, they fight this war, they ended up getting closer to 80% of it. Mm-hmm. That's That's 67 borders. Israel gets 80% of it. But
So they're willing to accept 80-20.
They have said they're willing to accept 80-20 on the record many times. Now there's also been lots of rhetoric that, like Hamas has used that kind of, counters that. But I think there's almost no question that they would take that deal if they were offered.
And if it's 80-20, what happens to all the Jewish settlers that live in the area that's now part of that 20?
Well,
how many people are we talking about?
I don't know the exact numbers. There's not. They already moved out the settlers who were in the Gaza area. They do have settlements in the West Bank. And I don't know what exactly the negotiation of that would be. But, the truth is that it was illegal for Israel to build those settlements. There's a violation of international law.
Settlements?
Yeah, well, they just kind of kept moving because this is basically since the late 1970s, they've been in what they called the peace process, where the government of Israel has kind of said that one day we're working toward giving them their own state at some point. But then they just kept building these settlements on Palestinian territory and building these big Jewish settlements there. And then it's like, oh, yeah, no, this is just indicating that there's no plan to move, to ever move toward granting the Arabs independence.
So is it individuals that are doing these settlements? Are they being guided or funded? Or because one of the things that I saw that was super disturbing, I don't know how accurate this is or what the actual story was there was a Jewish settler who had taken over the home that a Palestinian family had at one point in time.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, that's there have been cases of that. Well, it works because the government allows them to do it, and that those Palestinian people have no rights. And if they decide they're going to do it, they let them do it. And this has kind of been what's going on the whole time.
Palestine, or is it in Israel? Is it in Gaza?
I don't know the specific story you're talking about, but I do know that there's been for years in both Gaza and the West Bank, which are basically the two big sections that are Palestinian territory, but really controlled by the Israelis. That they've done. There's been settlement building on both sides of them. I don't know the specifics of that story, but there's little stories of really fucked up things happening on all of this, and it's been waves of that for a very long time.
So those people have all moved out since October 7th. Is that what you're saying?
Wait, you're saying
settlements?
No, in Gaza.
Yes.
They moved out before that. So they in 2005. The Israelis did move all those settlers out, and they if the way they'll say it is they ended the occupation of Gaza. A more accurate thing is that the IDF pulled out of internally martial law style policing Gaza. And it's like Sheldon Richman, who, as I mentioned before, wrote a great book on this topic, Coming to America. The way he described it is he goes, it's kind of like if all the prison guards left the prison, but they locked all of the doors and surrounded the perimeter. And then they went, see, we freed you. It's like, no, that's not. So they pull out, they still controlled the border. They still controlled what went in and out. There's no airport. They have no seaport. They're not allowed to come and go as they please. They need permission from the Israelis in order to do so. They control the electricity, the utilities, the amount of medicine that gets in. And this is why international, human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they say, they were like, no, this is still occupied territory. Sorry, that doesn't count. That just because you're not doing martial law anymore doesn't mean it's not an occupied territory. But then this was in 2005. And then in 2006, at the insistence of the Americans, because this is George W. Bush when we were going on that whole spreading democracy around the world thing. You remember how great that was?
That worked out.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And so Condoleezza Rice and George W. Bush, they were the one that insisted that they should have elections in Gaza. So they kind of it was their idea. And that this is when Hamas won. They won a plurality and took most of the seats in their little parliament thing or whatever it is. And so that's what a lot of people refer back to when they go, today, a lot of the hawks who are supporting the war, you'll hear them say, oh, they voted for Hamas. So this is kind of what they get because they voted for Hamas. They're talking about back in 2005, which is, half the population there, I think, is under 18. So none of them even voted in that election. You know what I mean? Right. And it's not like they won like an overwhelming supermajority or anything like that. But so that's what. So it was around that time in 2005 when they did get those settlements out. The Israeli government forced them. I think they kind of did like a I think they paid him off to move type of thing. So like an eminent domain deal, like where, here, take this money, you got to move, but you don't have any choice about it. You got to move. Right. So that might be a necessary part of some of this, or maybe an arrangement could be worked out where those settlements are kept. I do just think that it's if you want to move toward any type of serious solution to this, in the same way, like the other week that Osama bin Laden's letter to America went like super viral on TikTok, and then they scrubbed it off of The Guardian as a response to it, which is just, number one, like, what is that? Doesn't that just say everything about our society? Is that's the response? To scrub it off The Guardian? Take it down so people can't see it.
The Guardian being the newspaper covered it?
Yeah, they had published it, and it had been up there, I think, since.
And what were they? They were concerned that it was encouraging people to support it.
Yeah, like a bunch of TikTokers, like young lefty TikTokers, started like making these videos where they're like, Osama bin Laden was right about everything, and then they were getting heat for it, so they just took it down. I mean, you can still find it like on the archives and stuff.
But still, a lot of people's videos are still up, right? There's a lot.
I don't know about that. I'm not on TikTok. I kind of just saw on Twitter when people were sharing the TikTok videos, so I don't know if they were taking them down. I know TikTok takes down stuff pretty quickly, but I don't know. I don't know what they were doing with that.
Why would they take that down though? If I was a Chinese-run propaganda corporation, TikTok removes hashtag for Osama bin Laden's letter to America after viral videos circulate. So it did just remove the hashtag. The Guardian also pulled the text of the Al-Qaeda founder's letter from its website after people cited it on TikTok and X. That's not the correct response.
Yeah,
I mean, listen, Osama bin Laden was trained by the United States. Like he was a part of our thing to run the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets.
And not just trained, but trained for a specific reason. Trained to lure a superpower into a war in Afghanistan that will bankrupt them. Yeah. I mean, we trained him on how to do it and then fell for it.
The idea that you shouldn't read that guy's words.
Oh, it just tells you that that's
it's not justifying September 11th.
Yeah, like
it's just like understand that there's a lot of contributing factors to all of these global conflicts.
Yeah, educate yourself. Yeah. And look, like people were all arguing about it too, because obviously it's kind of stupid for like a young TikToker to be like, the takeaway is that he was a good guy or something like that. Like that's pretty ridiculous. But then people would like kind of point to what they want to in the situation. But basically the letter says, it's like, I mean, to sum it up, it's kind of like he goes, you may be wondering why we attack you. Well, we attack you because you attack us. And then a whole bunch of Islamist talk, a whole bunch of praise be to Allah and Sharia law shall sweep the world and all of that. And then a list of grievances along with that. And one of the major ones is what? It's that we prop up Israel, who has stolen the land from the Palestinian and keeps them under subjugation, that we have military bases in their holy land in Saudi Arabia, that we use those bases for the bombing and sanction campaigns that killed so many Iraqi babies, and that we prop up these dictators in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And, like, I think the takeaway from that is not, therefore Osama bin Laden was right to kill a bunch of innocent people in the Twin Towers, because that's stupid and evil. And it's the same justification in a way, but I shouldn't even say this, not in a way. Osama bin Laden made the exact same argument that the people who are saying they voted for Hamas, therefore we can kill them, are making. That's what he said. He was like, you vote for your government and your government does all this stuff to us. So you, American citizen, are fair game for us to attack. And any decent person should just immediately reject that. Like, no, it doesn't follow that because you have elections that therefore if any crime that Bill Clinton commits, you can now go kill some baby. That's insane. That doesn't make any sense. But in the same sense, the idea that some Palestinian baby doesn't have any rights and is fair game to just be blown up. And even if you want to make the argument that like, okay, but we're not trying to blow up that baby, we're just willing to blow up that baby while we're trying to catch some bad guys. It's just like, that's just not right. It's just like, that's not fair. That's not just. We would never accept that if we were talking about our kids. You know what I mean? Like if some murderer, even a mass murderer, ran into a daycare and, you know, held a bunch of people as hostages and said, using them as human shields, let's say, we would never say, okay, well, the sheriff department's going to come down and blow up the building. We'd be like, wait, what?
Right.
Like, that's insane, dude. Like, what? You couldn't even imagine if that was suggested, if it was like our kids there.
Right.
You'd be like, what are you, out of your mind? Okay, take that option, take that off the table. What else you got, you know?
Right.
And like, but why should that be acceptable, like, in this case?
Well, the argument against it is that Hamas is doing this on purpose and that they're putting all of these military bases. Oh, this is another thing you brought up. You said that there was this talk of tunnels that were under one of the hospitals, and you said some of it was computer-generated images?
Yeah, well, so this is just recently. So the Al Shifa hospital there, right? So the Israeli government said there was like a raid on the hospital, and they said that there was a huge like network of tunnels, and that this was basically their command center was under this hospital, and they created a computer-generated like image of what they say it looks like, what's under there. And it kind of reminds, do you ever remember, I think it was Colin Powell who had the ones of Osama bin Laden's layers? It was like this crazy complicated, none of that was real. But
that's right. That was there was like super sophisticated structures
super
inside
computers,
the
and it's inside of like looks like a volcano type thing. And this is where they're playing.
Oh,
none of that was real.
Wild.
By the way.
Colin Powell's diagram of Osama bin Laden's super sophisticated evil villain lair that was carved into the side of a mountain. I think it was in the same UN speech where he brought the vials of. I might be wrong about that. It might have been from a different. Yeah. I think it might have been a different one. But yeah. But so they released that, and then they go in and they rate. Now, part of I think, you know, the reason why they were suggesting that's what it is because it would. You know, it would require such a justification because when you're going and attacking a hospital, you know, like you'd need something really crazy to be under there. Right.
And then, look, it's a little bit in doubt exactly what it is. So they get there and the IDF releases videos of in the hospital, and there's like a couple rifles in the hospital.
Wasn't there also videos of Hamas like funneling hostages through a hospital or something like that?
That one I have not seen. But in this video, they just basically show you there are some weapons, and then they showed you kind of like the opening of like what appears to be a tunnel underneath the hospital. But they say, oh, it's booby-trapped, and so we can't go in there, and no journalists can go in there. So we don't actually see what's like, you know what I mean? Like exactly what's going on. Like there certainly hasn't been any proof that it was exactly what the computer generated image was. Then another interesting little detail here is
but there is a tunnel opening.
Yes, for sure. But then Barak, who was the former prime minister of Israel, he said recently in an interview, he said, we know that there's tunnels there because we built them. And the interviewer questions him again. She goes, I'm sorry, did you misspeak? Or did you say you know that there were tunnels there because you built them? And he goes, no, I'm saying we built them. Back when we were doing martial law and the IDF was in Gaza in the 80s, we built this tunnel underneath this hospital. So we know that it's there. So I guess he said they built it to like expand the hospital or something like that. But it was a weird admission. So it's like, because he's saying we know it's there because we built it. But then the real question isn't that. So then if you say that, well, then just showing me the picture of a tunnel proves nothing at all. Because that's not even indicating that Hamas is using this as some type of central, you know, command station.
Right.
So the question is, what was being used there? And by the way, I am not at all, to be clear, I'm not saying like I wouldn't be shocked if I found out that there were Hamas people
and
in
that
that.
It was
in that
booby
tunnel.
trapped.
Yeah, like all of this could be
Makes
true,
sense.
but we have not seen any evidence to back up that claim. We've just heard, you know, assertions made by the Israeli government. So that's, you know what I mean.
Did you find that Colin Powell thing?
I found the smallest picture of all time. It wasn't a very good picture at all. And then I found the speech he had. The speech didn't have the video or the pictures of it. I'll show you what I found.
You know, they
Found
found
anything
the temple of the first
Yes.
emperor of China. I think they found it in 1974. This is from they buried him 2,200 years ago, and
Okay.
they protected him with terracotta statues of soldiers. You ever seen this?
No.
And they're terrified to go into the tomb because there's all these writings about it having rivers of mercury and booby trapped and
Really?
and it's supposed to be like unbelievable riches, but they're so concerned, like trying to send a scientist through there and trying to open it up and find out what would happen. I mean, even 2,200 years later, that there literally might be rivers of mercury.
That's pretty
awaiting
wild.
Some fucking Indiana Jones shit.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen what it looks like?
No, I don't think
Dude,
so.
it's insane. I believe they found it in 74-ish, somewhere around then.
Okay.
And this is the very first emperor of China. And as they uncovered more and more and more, they found a literal army. I don't know what the number of these terracotta statues of soldiers, but it's fucking insane.
Wow.
And this is all lined up in front of his tomb. How many of them were there? So find the first emperor. Find a tomb of the first emperor of China.
8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots, 520 horses.
150 cavalry horses, the majority of which remain in situ in the pits near, I don't know how to say that, King Shi Huang's mausoleum. Other non-military terracotta figures were found in other pits, including officials, acrobats, strongmen, and musicians.
Dude, you think about how much effort it would have taken to make all of that 2,000 years ago?
Here it is. 100 flowing rivers were simulated using mercury, and above them the ceiling was decorated with heavenly bodies, below which lay the features of the land. Some translations of this passage refer to models or imitations. However, those words were not used in the original text, which also makes no mention of the terracotta army. High levels of mercury were found in the soil of the tomb mound, giving credence to, I don't know how to say his name, Simi Quan's account. Also, the emperor is well documented for building monumental statues in human form during his reign, such as the 12 metal colossi. What is that? Click on that. 12 metal colossi. What is that?
12 meters high.
Oh.
Let's find a picture.
Why do they call it 12 metal? 12 metal colossis.
12 bronze statues cast. Let's see.
Is there photos of these things?
It's not there.
But how crazy is that? There is high levels of mercury in the soil, and they're really concerned that if they open up a door, rivers of mercury will flow out and kill everybody. Like, how much mercury did they get? Where'd you get all that mercury?
Why were you storing all that mercury down
How
there?
did you store all that mercury? How'd you know that it would fucking stay there and not kill everybody? How did you get it there? How many people died moving it there?
Yeah, there's some...
Rivers of mercury? See, like you would say ordinarily that's nonsense. But the amount of dedication they had towards their emperor, that they were building this after
and the
he was
fact that
dead.
the soil tested
Yeah.
high in mercury, those two combined does make it enough where, like, I'm not opening it up.
Jesus Christ.
I'd like someone else to do it and bring a video camera, but I'm not going to be there.
Yeah, can't we send some robots to open that up? But imagine if it just flows out. Like, that would be so wild. Get some GoPro footage of rivers of 2,200-year-old mercury.
Yeah, that would be pretty nuts.
Like, how much would it take to do that? Like, how much mercury would you need? Like, what are we talking about? Where's mercury come from?
How
do you even get it?
Have no answer for you on how this possibly could be true.
How do you get mercury? Like, if you want to get mercury for a thermometer, where are you getting that?
I don't know.
I've never even thought of it.
Yeah, me
Not
neither.
until right now. I never even thought, where could one get mercury?
Well, you never
I knew
thought a lot
mercury
about
poisoning
it?
is
Chinese people,
I
they
guess
put a lot of thought into
I guess
it.
the fuck they did. If they have rivers of mercury waiting to kill you if you open up the tomb. Mercury occurs naturally in the Earth's crust. It's released into the environment from volcanic activity, weathering of rocks, and as a result of human activity. So how would you produce mercury? How do you refine it? It's a naturally occurring chemical element found in rock in the Earth's crust. So they figured this out 2,000 years ago, how to refine this? What did they do? Like, how did they refine it? Like, how did they get it to the point where there's so much of it, you have rivers of it?
That Cinnabar stuff came up before when we were looking at stuff. I think maybe with Brimer-escu.
An ore in combination with cinnabar. It tends to be found in high concentration in geographic.
Grinding cinnabar.
Wow.
I know they used it for red, like anything red back forever was.
Imagine if that's your job and you know it's going to kill you. You have to make mercury for the emperor's temple to set up a booby trap. So you're out there just making mercury all day, just dying.
I bet those people have pride in their job. They're like, hey, someone's got to make the emperor's mercury. You know, I'm out here doing it.
I wonder.
And you needed mercury to get gold.
Oh wow, how's that?
I'm looking at something that says cinnabar is a mineral from which mercury is extracted. Both are highly toxic. Few countries still permit cinnabar mercury mining. Mercury was very important in gold mining. So
they had a lot of gold back then, right? Didn't they?
Yeah, I think so.
I think that's when they were starting.
So that's probably a side effect of their gold mining, is that they had all this mercury. Does that make sense?
I don't know.
How are you getting rivers of it?
Yeah, the rivers of it don't really make sense to me. But that also may not be true.
What is? Well, it might be true though. If there's high levels of mercury in the soil.
that is. I will say that gives you a little bit of pause.
Yeah.
One thing I've heard that it hasn't come up a lot is like when there's all those puddles on the ground. If not puddles, they're just like reservoirs of water to look at the stars. It's easier to look down than to look up all night. So they would make something reflective to show the stars coming over in certain patterns or whatnot. Mercury is also highly reflective. So if they had
puddles of mercury that they would use for like mirrors to look
Yeah.
at the stars. Wow. Yeah, maybe.
But so the amount of effort
kills you.
theoretically to collect all this mercury, rivers of it,
Yeah.
and store it in there for what purpose?
Booby trap.
Just so that you couldn't come in?
So if someone comes in, they get flooded with mercury and they never get to the emperor's riches.
Okay.
Apparently, there's fucking a gajillion dollars worth of shit in there.
Ooh, all right. See, now you made it a little bit more interesting. Okay, I didn't realize that's what they were keeping you from. So now, are you going to roll the dice on the rivers of mercury for
Roll
$1
the
jillion?
dice, pussies, come on.
like,
Get a
dude.
hazmat suit and a fucking scuba. Let's go. Don't they have those fucking DARPA robots? Get one of them DARPA robots to lift off the lid.
Yeah, I can't believe you couldn't like figure something out.
Get
Yeah, like
the
one of those
DARPA robot.
those like the bomb, robots. You see them sometimes in like Times Square or something like that.
But if it's really river, then you're gonna lose all the terracotta statues, which are like a national treasure.
Well, you want to roll the dice on more treasure? You got to
Maybe-
risk some statues.
Maybe you have to move the statues. Can you imagine? I mean, they moved entire temples in Egypt. Do you ever see what they did?
No.
Oh my God. What an undertaking. Massive, enormous statues. They
And why did they
sawed
move them?
them and moved them. I believe it was to make room for a dam.
Okay.
I think that's what it was.
But so they took it apart and
oh
then
my
put
God,
it back
they
together?
took it apart and put it back together again.
Wow.
And, these epic works of stone art from thousands and thousands of years ago, and they're fucking sawing them and lifting them and moving them.
It's such a weird thing.
So you
Like,
can find that footage because it's crazy what they did.
isn't it weird to think about the idea like we build some buildings to be cool looking buildings today, you know what I mean? Like some of the new buildings we build, but almost all of them are just built with like a purpose. You know what I mean? And it's so like weird to think about a time when human beings were just like in the game of building gigantic monuments to look, because like you imagine in a world with like look, I guess we don't know exactly what technology they had at the time, but just like back then, like to just go and see the pyramids or something like that would just be like, whoa.
I would, if I had like a moment in history, like they're gonna only pick one time where I could exist in like a bulletproof bubble where nothing could touch me, but I could stand and observe.
Just see
I
it.
would want to be like right at the plateau, like right in front of the Great Pyramid. What did you do?
Yeah.
What was your culture like? How did you guys do this? No one knows. It's 100% guesswork. When they talk about the construction of it, it's the dumbest theories. None of them make any sense. Not a single one. From the simple fact that they're cutting these things from a quarry that was hundreds of miles away, and they're moving these fucking giant stones, many of them weigh 50 tons plus,
Yeah.
through the mountains. 500 miles to get to Giza. How?
And every like attempted explanation always just falls short. It's
All
like
of
they used pulleys and ropes and
It's
levers.
so
and,
spectacular what they did that it defies any conventional explanation. If you told a construction company that they had to do that, and they had to do it within the life of a pharaoh, which is the most ridiculous proposal, because if you cut and place 10 stones a day, I believe it is, it would take you 664 years to make the pyramid. Cut and place massive, so this is it. They sawed this fucking face off. They saw this whole thing. It's crazy when you see the video footage of it, because that thing, they moved all of that. And they moved it over a relatively short period of time. Which is so nuts. And so they sawed it and moved it and sawed it and moved it. You know, what's one of the most amazing things that I've been educated on about Egypt is not even just the pyramids. The pyramids are insane, but their pottery is nuts. Their pottery is nuts. They have taken computer measurements of it. So they've taken like
You mean like their
3D,
ancient pottery?
Yeah,
Like
3D. Some of their pottery is not pottery. It's carved out of insanely hard stone in perfect symmetry with a handle, where if you spin it on a wheel, it's perfect. It's within less than a human hair difference on each side. And we have no idea how they did it.
Yeah, like how
They're just these they're not ceramic, these stone vases that they built defy explanation.
Well, it's yeah, and that's part of the thing about the pyramids too, right? It's the level of precision. It's the level of like how they face true north,
Yes.
east, and west.
Not
and like
just
the,
that,
yeah.
the faces.
Right,
The
right.
faces are perfectly symmetrical.
And from our understanding of what technology they had, like what the official historical kind of, what they would say, it's like, well, that just makes no sense.
None of it
You're
makes
saying with
any
no
sense.
technology, they were able to do this thing that we, with our modern technology, can't figure out. That doesn't
Exactly.
make sense. It's like something else. And the thing, and I learned all this stuff from you. Like I didn't know nothing about this until I heard you talk about it years ago. But the water erosion on the Sphinx is a really big one too that I've never heard a satisfactory like rebuttal to.
Yeah, these are all interesting things that they're making, Jamie. But the ones that are really fucking insane.
I know, but it says like they're keeping their ancestors' traditions alive here.
Yeah.
It shows them digging with these crazy tools into the ground. and
Right,
doing-
but they're also using steel. Supposedly steel hadn't even been invented then. They were just using copper. These guys are all using steel. I mean, look, this is all beautiful work, but this is not those vases, those impossibly symmetric vases. Some of these things that you see them, they're like insanely hard. And okay, there's no evidence of a diamond use in ancient Egypt, although substance like that must have been utilized. Some of these vases, when they find the perfectly intact ones, they're impossibly symmetrical. And they seem to have been carved out where they have like a very small lip, but they go inside and it's perfectly carved out in the center. Like, how'd you do that? How did you do that? And how did you make it perfectly symmetrical? You're not even spinning it on a wheel because you have handles on it. So how did you put the handles and how'd you make the handles perfectly symmetrical?
So do you think, and by the way, you know a lot more about this than me, but do you think it is like the most, because again, the one I said, the water erosion on the Sphinx is the one that gets me that I've never heard a good rebuttal to. Because
There's no good rebuttal.
It's clearly water erosion.
It's not just water, it's thousands of years of rainfall.
Right. And they know that there wasn't rainfall in that period from like 10,000 years or
Yes.
something like that, right? So do you think it's that the most plausible explanation is that all of this stuff is not the time period that we put ancient Egypt? It's many, many years before that, and we must have been at some type of peak of technological advancement that is a different type of peak than we've arrived at today. We don't really understand what that is. And then all of that that collapsed, and what we think of as ancient Egypt is just kind of like what was left after that. And basically people just walked into these things that they had already been built.
Yes.
Is that like the most reasonable
Yeah,
explanation?
it's the most
you think?
reasonable. And it's also the most reasonable when you consider what they did to the pyramid. Because the Great Pyramid was covered with smooth limestone. And they looted it to create Cairo. So the same knuckleheads that existed after the pyramids were built were so stupid. They took chunks of the pyramid off to build like fucking shitty houses.
That was your you had the whole bit about that. It's like
Yeah.
the same guy who built it is like is the guy with the dog on a canoe type thing. You're like, You're like, I think that was the dummy who did that one. I don't
Yeah,
think,
I think
but that-
dudes just showed up and they showed up for payday, and the smart people were all dead. That was my joke. Was that we're the
Yeah.
children of the idiot stoneworkers of Egypt? But I think it's the Younger Dryas impact theory. I think that's the most plausible. And that's because there's physical evidence of it. And that's something that Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock have talked about extensively. And then there's this whole group of actual scientists that are studying this impact theory because they have physical evidence of, in the core samples, of iridium at high levels at 11,800 years ago. And that's when they think it probably wiped out most of civilization. And that's also probably one of the reasons why, if you go way back in civilization, is 5,000, 6,000 years ago, people were barbaric because those are the people that survived. So now go 6,000 years before that where there's no history. There's nothing. Like ancient Sumer, right? That's 6,000 years ago, Mesopotamia. Like that's
and
where
that's about as far back as we.
That's what we used to believe.
Yeah, right.
Before Göbekli Tepe, we used to believe that was the origin of a sophisticated civilization that was capable of writing. It was capable of mathematics. It had some general understanding, at least of our solar system, in terms of like they had charted not just the sun, but all the planets in the proper order. They don't know why they did it or how they did that. But that is 6,000 years ago. And until recently, it was pretty widely believed that that was the origins of civilization. Then when they found Göbekli Tepe, which is for sure carbon dated to have been covered up, meaning someone either conquered it or someone decided, fuck these people, we're going to cover it. And they did that intentionally 11,600 years ago. So they know that at least 11,000 years ago, people were building these massive stone structures
Right.
with
So it's
3D carving, super complicated 3D carving where the animal was carved out of the stone and the rest of the stone remained, not carved into the stone.
So it's not like the old story of like, oh, we were basically like hunter-gatherers until the ancient Sumerian society
Right.
came along. It's like, no. Something much more than that was going on.
And they think that the 11,600 years ago thing was still thousands of years after people were building the pyramids. The people that are putting like the oldest date on the pyramids, like John Anthony West, who is this renegade Egyptologist that had this fantastic series called Magical Egypt. And this guy had this his life's work was studying Egypt and studying the history of Egypt. And one of the more amazing things is that Egypt has a written history in the hieroglyphs that go back 30,000 plus years. But archaeologists conveniently dismiss that as myth. And they say that, no, it's like 2,500 BC, and that's when it all emerges. But the problem with that is why would they lie about that? Like, this is just so that you can put your timestamp where you think it should be, and this is what you've been teaching in lectures, been teaching in books.
Well, that might be part of the motivations too. Is if if you're the one who's been teaching this for a long time, or if you're the one who even maybe discovered something, and that's kind of what you hang your hat on, for someone to discover that you've been teaching the wrong thing the whole time and you're wrong about all of that, I'm sure you're going to counter some resistance. That's kind of true in almost any field. If you're coming in and going, hey, you guys all have it wrong.
Right.
This is right. You're going to get a lot of resistance from people who are being like, no, my whole identity is that I'm right about this.
Yeah.
So you don't get to just take that all away from me. And now I got to go back and be like, all right, that thing I've been teaching, forget all of that. Let's move on to this.
But it has been taken away from them for the most part in a lot of instances. And the Göbekli Tepe one is where they're the most ridiculous because they want to believe that hunter-gatherers built these structures.
Yeah, that's tough to believe.
It's insane. These things are you've seen Göbekli Tepe?
Oh, yeah,
it's
I've seen
fucking
pictures of it.
huge.
Yeah.
And it's only one of many of these megalithic structures that they found that are still buried. They've only uncovered that. When they use ground penetrating lidar, I think they've uncovered 5% of it. And it's fucking insanely impressive. So someone was doing something really wild at a time where we thought people were using stone tools to hunt, deer and shit.
And perhaps they were in parts of the world.
They definitely were.
But
They're doing it right now.
Yeah,
That's the thing we have to understand. Like right now, there's indigenous people that live in the Amazon. There's people that live on North Sentinel Island. There's a lot of like very primitive tribes in terms of like the way we view ancient history. They live the way people lived a long fucking time ago. And they coexist with people with iPhones. And the idea that every single moment and era in history, there was an equal distribution of technology and information is ridiculous because it doesn't exist now.
Yeah, well,
it
look,
doesn't
I mean,
exist in the most ubiquitous time in terms of like the access to information and cell phone usage and fucking most people on Earth have a cell phone, and yet still there's primitive tribes.
100%. But even like we were talking about for a lot of this podcast, the Israel-Palestine thing. I mean, there's this huge divide versus the way those two live. This crazy power imbalance.
Yes.
And that's, by the way, I think that's why, which maybe is unfair, but I think that's why I kind of like I hold the powerful to a higher standard in a sense. Because there is such this divide in power. Yeah. That's why it's more like, blaming the U.S. empire for all of these things. It's like because, even when people would say like, oh, you put all of this blame on, with the Ukraine war, which by the way, we're breaking up with now. I wanted to say something about that. But then it's like, well, just because it's like, well, yeah, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, America's the sole superpower of the world. So it's like you have so much more power than them. Like now's the time to not provoke them and pick a fight with them when they're no threat to you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's amazing that kind of like the power imbalance we have with all that the United States of America, literally, if we decided to, and we haven't for now, and that's very good, but we could disappear an entire country.
Yeah.
If we wanted to, with the snap of a finger, we can just make you disappear. And then the other things that we will use, we can overthrow your government, we can mass bomb you.
And there are countries that are completely helpless simultaneously.
Yeah, that's
that exist
right.
at the same time.
Yeah.
It kind of only makes sense that Egypt was the most advanced because Egypt was in Africa. And Africa is where humans literally came from.
Right.
The idea that the only humans that advanced were the ones that left Africa. That was the idea that everybody had. That the humans left Africa and then they founded Europe.
Right.
But it appears that was the most sophisticated society ever. And what we are is a rebuilding of human society. Many, 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 many thousands of years later. Many thousands of years later, after people had already achieved a level of sophistication beyond where we're at now, but through totally different methods. That we haven't even invented yet. We've gotten so far along the combustion engine, petrochemical products, electronics. We've gotten so far down that road that we think it's the only technological path. And it's not necessarily.
Right, definitely not.
If these people that made that temple made rivers of mercury back then, and we know that's 2,200 years ago. Like, what the fuck did they do before the impact? Like, how sophisticated was society 20,000 years ago? Because we want to think it's not sophisticated at all. But what John Anthony West thinks is that the reason why the Sphinx was facing a very particular way, he says, I think it's 35,000 years ago, 34,000 years ago, that was facing the constellation Leo. So he thinks that if you look at the thousands of years of rainfall that they believe is responsible for the fissures on the side walls, like how many thousands? Like how many? Could it be 20? And are they telling the truth about it? Is it really a 34,000-year-old structure that indicates that 34,000 years ago people had achieved this insane level of sophistication? Because they keep pushing back further and further and further the original age of a human being, like the original Homo sapiens. It keeps going. It used to be 50,000 years. Now it's like hundreds of thousands of years. Like, what happened?
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, do you think about, because it's really interesting the way you say it. I don't know. You think about like the butterfly effect.
Yeah.
That idea, which I don't even know. Like if I completely.
Well, that's horseshit.
Yeah,
but fucking wind patterns.
Well,
it's weather. It's
oh,
heat,
no,
sun,
but like the idea.
Solar flares.
But
the idea the wings of a butterfly can cause a fucking hurricane.
Right. Yeah, but there is certainly some truth to the fact that if you like rewinding the tape and like starting and playing it, there are different decisions that like one crucial decision could send your life in a whole different path or something like that, right? So like the idea that if we were like kind of running this whole start from scratch again, it's not at all a given that we end up in even a similar place at the end of that. And you think about like the process of time. Like I love this. I used to talk about this in your act a bunch too, which I always thought was a really interesting way to look at it. Like when you talk about where you had the bit where it was like 300 years. Yeah, is that's three people.
Yeah,
like could be the length
people
of
live to be 100.
Yeah, you know what I mean. Like that's really not that crazy.
This country was founded 3 people ago.
Right, and that's a really interesting way to look at it. Where if you just go like it's like if you want to go, 150 years ago, like the oldest person I know is 99. So like me plus her is almost 150 years ago.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like
nothing.
that's not
Yeah.
much. And if you think about, say,
That's pre-Civil War.
right. So you're going back now to a time
Almost.
Well, right, just shy.
Just shy.
But it's just about pre-industrial revolution,
Yes.
or right around that time. Basically,
Yeah.
is the industrial revolution is basically me and the oldest person I know ago, and that's everything. What we talk
Yep.
about with our modern technology today, that's the whole basis of it right there.
Sure.
Like before then, it's night and day difference to the way civilizations are, and that's it. Just that little bit of time
Tiny
that took
blink
us
of
from
an eye.
literally like we're an agricultural society to the Joe Rogan podcast. You know what I mean? In this little
Blip.
blip of time.
It's wild. Yeah, it's wild that it's not stopping. We're in the center of it, so it seems stable, but it's accelerating at a fucking super bizarre pace. A super bizarre pace.
Yes.
It's just impossible for us to see it totally, like all the innovation that's happening simultaneously. It's like the whole thing is wild. And we're experiencing it from an individual perspective. We're looking out at our eyes and getting a map of the world based on our neighborhood and where we go and the things we do and the media we consume. But what's really happening is if you could see all the babies that were born at this, if there was a giant screen where you could see every baby coming out of a person every time it happened, it would just be like, what? Just life pouring into this dimension. And if you could look at all the innovation that was happening simultaneously on some sort of a chart, it would be, what? It would be just babies and technology flooding our dimension. Babies and technology. That's what's really going on. And all this other stuff, like the fighting for resources, is all an aspect of this constant movement towards new life and innovating technology.
Yeah. And like you were saying, like we're kind of it's a technology is we're in this period where it's like in exponential growth, and so it's like we're just starting to kind of get like a little bit of a vision of what that's going to look like.
Flashes every time a baby is born in that country.
It's 100 since I've been on it.
Yeah, the babies are just constantly coming out.
Yeah.
That is kinda
Every
wild.
second, babies are coming out. All of them.
150 in like 2 seconds.
Yeah, bam. They're just flooding out.
Yeah.
It's just a dimensional portal where life is coming through vaginas into our dimension. Just whoa. And that's all everybody wants to do is fuck. Everybody wants to fuck. And everybody wants to make more babies. Let's.
Didn't you feel like I remember feeling this way when I like first had kids, because I got little kids. You have older kids than me, but I've been, my oldest is like about to turn 5. But I remember when the first time we had a baby, when I first got my wife pregnant, and then when she had the baby and stuff, like really feeling this weird, this connection to just the fact that like I am an animal. You know what I mean? Like you're
Right.
like I am
Animal
an
creates
animal,
life.
and this is what I'm here to do. That like everything's kind of been working toward this, and this was like the point of it all.
Well, it
You know-
certainly rewires your brain.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It rewires your brain and makes your brain concentrate on that above all. And in a strange way, it's like Louis C.K. said it best once. He said, "You just got to let it change you." And I'm
Yeah.
like, that's a very good way to put it, because that's kind of what you got to just really just let it change you. You can't resist it. The guys, you resist it. It's like, oh, but it is a part of this biological superorganism that's the human race, and it's capable of amazing things. But there's a constant battle. And this constant battle, you can call it good and evil, and that's the simplistic way to look at it. But there's forces that are moving, and these forces are required in order for things to progress. Even the forces of evil are required for someone to develop a system that combats evil, that's more efficient, and then enforce the idea that society should not be evil. We have seen the negative aspects of evil. We choose to never be evil. I mean, this was obviously there was a lot of flaws in the Founding Fathers, like we discussed, but that was their idea. We're going to do something better. We're going to do something. We all believe that we want to be free. Everyone wants to be free. That's why we're here. Let's set this up to keep it as free as possible from tyranny. And let's resist any and all efforts to change that. And that's what the like heavy duty constitutionalists feel. Like they're like, listen, there's a reason why they set it up this way.
And
because there's natural human impulses to control things. And, and you know, that's what everybody was terrified about with Trump. They're like, he's a dictator. He's going to get in the office. He's going to fucking ruin the Constitution and throw everyone in jail. And none of those things happen.
No, they literally just saying the other day. I literally just heard on MSNBC the other day. They were just sitting there going, you know, if Donald Trump wins this time, he is going to start prosecuting his political enemies.
Yeah, they're saying he's going to execute people.
But you're like, but you're literally doing that to him right now.
Right now.
So what are you talking about?
Over some fucking Fugazi price gouging scheme.
Oh, I did. There's what I wanted to say before, by the way. I forgot. So, but this, I don't know. I found this kind of rewarding. But so Joe Scarborough, who hosts Morning Joe on MSNBC, it's one of their biggest shows. So it might get like a tenth of the listens of this show or something. They're big. They're one of their big boys. And he called me out after the last time I was on here as being a pro-Putin propagandist.
Those pejoratives are always really effective.
Yeah, and then he said something about how I blamed America for 9/11.
Did you? How dare you?
Yeah, he said.
I didn't even know that. Get out of here.
And so he said, well, this is my final show here, guys. We had a good run. No, but I can't remember exactly what he said, but he took issue with me saying that, you know, Osama bin Laden had legitimate grievances, and he took issue with me saying we should negotiate an end to the war in Iraq. And I responded to him, and I said, well, look, if we can't agree that, you know, Osama bin Laden was, you know, had some legitimate grievances with our foreign policy, can we at least agree that it was a bad idea for your wife's dad to bankroll him? So that probably didn't go over too well because his wife is Mika Brzezinski, and her dad was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the guy who came up with the strategy to lure the Soviet Union into Afghanistan by funding the Mujahideen, Osama bin Laden. So his wife's dad bankrolled Osama bin Laden, but he's very morally outraged at me because I said he might have some legitimate grievances. Anyway, this is all I'm building
is that
up.
The end of the conversation?
I'm building up toward a compliment for Scarborough. Yeah, he didn't respond to that one. We tweeted back and forth a few times, but that was the final one. But he did. I'll compliment him because I saw just yesterday he said that we need to think about cutting funding for Ukraine and encouraging Zelensky to negotiate with Putin because now you're allowed to say that. It doesn't make you a Putin supporter anymore to say that.
Right.
So finally, after like 2 years of getting called all those names, it's just like all the stuff with COVID. Like just one day, you're allowed to talk about lab leak now.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, we all believe that.
Masks don't work.
Oh yeah. Oh, I know. I ruined your life because you said that last week. But no, it's totally cool to say that. We all agree with that now. But it's literally, and it is no coincidence that as soon as this war in Israel like popped off, there's just immediately it was almost perfect timing. There was this Time magazine piece that came out, and it was the same author. I'm blanking on his name, but it was the same guy who wrote the Man of the Year, or Person of the Year, they call it now. They gave Zelensky the Person of the Year, and this guy wrote that article. And so I'd imagine he got like some access to Zelensky's top people from that. And so now he just wrote another piece just a couple weeks ago that was just a devastating takedown of Zelensky, and it basically was all of his top guys being like, "This guy has lost it." And that the military are actively refusing orders. Oh god! Because he's basically like telling them to go, like get out there, and they're just like, we're going to get slaughtered. We're not doing it anymore.
Oh my god!
And so it's basically, I mean, I'm just saying, it's exactly what I was saying on the last several times I've been on here. And I'm not like trying to take the credit for it. It's just I read smart people who say this stuff, and I recognize that they're correct. But it's like what really great guys like what Scott Horton and all the guys at at antiwar.com, and what Ron Paul and what like all the people who have been like so great on the John Mearsheimer has just been incredible throughout this whole thing, nailing every time. But that all the U.S. saying we're going to give you this blank check to fight this war, and then going out of our way to break up active peace negotiations when they were happening. We'll give you a blank check to fund this war. All it did was just ensure that more people, particularly Ukrainians, were going to get slaughtered. And this war that could have been negotiated away at the very beginning. And then, you know, ironically, all the same people who support this, you know, the narrative the whole time was like Putin's a war criminal and he's violating international law and you can't get land by war. We can't negotiate with him because then we would be letting him acquire this land by war. And then the next day they're like, and we have to support Israel, who got the whole country by war. And by the way, I'm not like saying, because some people have said this to me before, like they'll be like, oh, so are you saying we should give all the land back to the Native Americans then, or something like that? But no, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying Israel should give all of Israel back. Like, there's people there now, and you're not going to do the same thing to them that they did to other people. You know what I mean? But if you're saying, should we give the Native Americans the land back? Well, like, no, that's not going to happen. But should we make sure that the ones who are still here are free and their natural rights are protected? Like, yeah, definitely. So that's all I'm saying about that. But anyway, they were outraged about Putin taking this land by war. Look, this thing, like just the practicality of it, he's going to end up keeping some of that territory. And that's that. Ukraine doesn't have the strength to take it back from him. So,
well, particularly if we cut them off.
Yeah.
When you see Zelensky asking for credit, you're like, oh, God.
Oh my God, that was drug addict vibes, wasn't it? He was like scratching his neck and shit. It was just kind of like, credit, please. I have an old boat I can sell you.
I don't know if you know this about me, Dave Smith, but I like weapons.
Dude, it's just so, oh man, is that, and that whole thing just unraveling. And you know, the problem, like with so much of this stuff about, like even like what I was saying with Israel, Palestine and all that, it's like, look, man, if you just want to understand what's going on, if you want to solve a problem, you got to at least just like look at what's really happening here, right?
Yeah.
They said that's the first step, right, to solving a problem is recognizing you have one.
Yeah.
And it's this whole time, the issue with the war propaganda is that then you never solve it. Because you're just looking at something that, like, if you just say Osama bin Laden hates us because we're free, well, what are we going to do?
Right.
Stop being free? So the only answer here is go to war, something like that, you know? But if you understand that, like, oh, there's also, like, Osama bin Laden attacked us for being free. Well, why didn't he attack Sweden for being free or Denmark for being free, you know?
Right.
Was Al-Qaeda really happy in 2020? Because they were like, oh, look, they're locked down. They don't have so much of that freedom that we hate so much, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, these
It's like,
simplistic narratives, like the Putin's a war criminal, that's that, and this is it, you can't do that, and that we have to support Ukraine, without any understanding of how it got to be that way in the first place that you described, the coup of 2014, and then NATO moving arms closer and closer, and the red line that Putin had said established. Long ago.
Which was and if you guys didn't listen to me the last couple times I've been on here, I talked a whole lot about all that stuff.
Yeah.
But and also just the fact that and look, by the way, I'll also say I do think Putin's a war criminal, and like so I'm not denying that. But the way we would paint Ukraine as this bastion of democracy was just ridiculous.
Did you ever see the Candace Owen thing? It was amazing.
What did she say?
New York Times tweets at Candace Owens because Candace Owens says that Ukraine is corrupt, and they say to her, "What evidence do you have that the New York Times is corrupt?" And she says, "Oh, evidence from your fucking newspaper." And she quotes all these articles.
Yeah,
she posts all these articles from like 2017.
Yeah,
they were talking about how in the New York Times how corrupt Ukraine is.
Right, because before Vladimir Putin invaded, that lie hadn't even been told yet. Nobody was saying that Ukraine was a bastion of democracy. It was known as the most corrupt country in Europe. The idea that that would even be, especially for the New York Times, that would even be at all a controversial view.
It's young kids that are working there that are activists, essentially.
Yeah, well,
and they're fresh out of university. They're doing their journalism, and they don't have an understanding of the history.
Well, a lot of the
ideological narratives.
A lot of the adults go along with it too. That you know what I mean, because there does become this. It's like this narrative that gets created. One of the things I remember, Scott Horton talked about this. I think in one of his speeches, or it might have been in one of his debates. But he was talking about how in 1996 there was, I think it was on CBS. They got like an interview with Osama bin Laden. And he was already, you know, like they were running Al-Qaeda and they had pulled off some small scale terrorist attacks. I think this was the African embassy bombing had happened then and stuff. And they were asking, and he said they just like reported it as a matter of fact. Like it was just like, well, they hate us for our military presence in the Middle East, you know?
Yeah.
Back to weather or whatever. Like that was just a fact. And that it wasn't until later that the lie got told that it's, oh, they hate us for our freedom. And so with that stuff, no, there were the New York Times was reporting on the Nazi presence in Ukraine. Yeah. That was a known thing. Nobody was disputing this.
But it was inconvenient.
Yes, until after this. Yeah. And then you got to go at this country that like he banned all the competing opposition parties to him. He said they're probably not going to hold elections. He nationalized the state media. He's drafting people to fight in this war. It's like, no, come on. This isn't anything that is representing like this perfectly free country. And whatever. It's just we would be way better off if we had never provoked the thing to begin with and never just decided to fund it for these years. And if you don't like look at that or grapple with that, then yeah, you're like, well, this is perfect democracy versus evil war criminals, so we have to just fund them forever, and all that does is get tens of thousands of more people killed.
The problem is to figure all this stuff out, you need alternative media. You
Yep.
are never going to hear all this stuff laid out the way you just laid it out. And people are going to fact check it, and they're going to find out you're right, and it's an eye-opener.
Yeah.
Because and you're like, well, what is wrong with the world that we're living in where we're never getting these straight narratives? We're always getting this very distorted, one-sided take, whether it's from the right or the left, on what's going on.
But I'll tell you, that's what I'm so like encouraged by, because like I remember, I mean, I was younger, but I was an adult when the war propaganda for the war in Iraq was being laid. I mean, I was a young adult. I think I guess 2003 was the start of the war, so I think I was 20. Yeah, I was 20 in 2003. So the year before it, 2002, which the whole year was a propaganda campaign to fight the war in Iraq. And I was 19. I'm old enough. I remember it quite well. And it was, look, the whole thing was just dominant. It was like, look, he's got weapons of mass destruction, and he planned 9/11 with Osama bin Laden. He's friends with Al Qaeda, and he has this weapon that you're like, he could pass it off to Al Qaeda at any point, and then they drop a nuke on Kansas. And if you don't believe this, you're some type of anti-American queer, who hates this country or something like that. Like, we all know this is true, and we just did not have anything like you. Back then, there was no show that was like way bigger than anything in the corporate media that would have anybody on who was like breaking down how all of this is lies. None of this is true, and we're going down a horrible path right now. And like today, we not only, it's not like we just have you, like you're the biggest, but there's you and Tucker Carlson, and then like on the other level, like so many shows that are like just like really letting the other side get out there. I mean, I was literally just listening the other day to Breaking Points with Cigar and Crystal, and I mean the discussion they're having on the war is just so many light years more like nuanced. Thoughtful and nuanced than anything you're seeing on Fox News or MSNBC or something like that. And there's so many shows like that now. Like there's this weird thing in the, I'm sure this happens to you all the time, where you'll like discover a show that you never heard of before, and you almost like look at like the view count on it, and you're like, oh, I never heard about these guys. What do they have? And it's like 700,000 views. Like, wow, there's a pretty big show. Yes. You know what I mean? And like, I had never even heard of these guys. There's so many shows at that level that people don't even, and so.
And this is recent.
Very, very recent.
Right.
Like this, to give a perspective of how recent it is, nothing like this existed when Barack Obama was running for president, right? Not on this level.
No.
When Donald Trump was running in 2016, still not even close to what it is now. There were a few of them, but there weren't like this many. 2020, there were some. So we've been through like one presidential election cycle with actually having this. And even this is a totally new dynamic where there's just so many more people. Now there's so many more presidential candidates who are like coming on these podcasts. Like you've had RFK on. RFK's on my podcast. I've had Vivek Ramaswamy on like 3 times. Like these guys are now realizing that they got to get, you know what I mean, to like get in front of audiences.
That's
need
the real
this.
Mainstream now.
Yeah.
Like when you're saying a video has 700,000 views, you know what's on CNN.
Yeah.
CNN struggles to get anywhere near that.
Michael Malice convinced me to stop using the term mainstream media.
Yeah.
And I think he's absolutely right, because he was like, they're not the mainstream anymore.
It's corporate-controlled media.
Corporate media. Like call them what they are. They're the corporate press, you know? And this is, but no, it's ridiculous to suggest that, again, like that somehow like, Brian Stelter is the mainstream and you are the alternative. Like that just doesn't make sense anymore.
Well, they thought that the case just a few years ago. They really didn't understand.
Yeah.
They didn't understand the landscape.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty, and there comes with because they've they've had such control. Like with all monopolies, there's this naturally growing like atrophy. Well, because you don't really have to
Try hard.
win people over.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like you just don't develop these skills. And then they almost just didn't have the skill to ever adjust to this changing landscape.
They can't because of the format.
Yeah.
The format won't allow them. Also, they can't speak freely.
Yeah.
Because they'll lose advertisers, especially if they do anything that's against either the corporate control, like whatever is funding these organizations. And we know a large part of it is pharmaceutical drug companies. A large part of it is food companies that are advertising shit that's fucking terrible for you. That's ruining
Weapons
people.
companies. I mean,
So many
yeah.
different things. And you're not going to change that. You're not going to change the structure where they do it, where they have a commercial every 7 minutes, so no conversation ever gets in depth. Everything is set up for people that have short attention spans because they thought that that's what people had.
Well, I mean, again, like I mentioned earlier when I was bringing up this this awesome Daryl Cooper like series of podcasts, it's like 20 hours long, and you need like even in a podcast like this, like I can do no justice to telling the entire history of this story. You need so much time.
Right.
But the idea that you would ever be like, I mean, I've literally seen segments like the debate I mentioned that I did the other day. I think we went like 2 hours or something like that. It's like a reasonable amount of time. Okay, you can get into some stuff in that. But I've seen they'll do panels on the war in Israel versus Gaza that are 7 minutes long.
Yeah.
With that time being split between
Three
two
people.
people and a moderator.
they're
Yes,
yelling
three
at
people.
each other.
And like how? So it just reduces everything down to like who can get the better sound bite off
Yes.
in a second.
Exactly.
And like, what is this? There's no way for
Exactly.
adults to communicate.
Yeah. Dave Smith, you're a national treasure. I always appreciate you coming on here and freaking everybody out.
Well, thank you, dude.
You put things into perspective. It's incredible how much information you've stored in your fucking head about all this stuff. But
Well, like I said, it's I've just read a lot of the right people, and I'm very lucky that I found like Ron Paul and the Mises Institute, mises.org, and antiwar.com, my guys over there, Scott Horton being the leader over there. And so I'm very lucky. I found a lot of people who do a lot of really great research and made a lot of really great arguments, and I'm not bad at remembering it and stuff. And I'm like the smartest dumb guy or the dumbest smart guy or something, where I'm like just smart enough to
Remember
kind of
it.
get it.
Yeah.
And then I'm still one of you, so I can come back and explain it. You know what I mean? In a good way that kind of makes sense. But dude, I mean, like, I'm so grateful for everything you've done for me, and that I get to come on here all the time and talk about this stuff, because I do think it's really important. And so I'm very grateful to you.
I'm very grateful for you too. Appreciate you. All right. Bye, everybody.